My name is David Harrow. I don't use my full name online, and I won't tell you which ranger district I work in, because if you knew, you'd find these trails. And I need you to understand something before anything else. Some trails should stay lost. I'm telling you this because I think people deserve to know that the national forests are not entirely mapped, that there are sections of land owned by the federal government, managed by the Forest Service, that exist in a kind of administrative dead zone. Places where the 3-year-old survey data is still the most recent. Places where a trail was closed 40 years ago and no one ever officially reopened it. But it's still there, still used, still claiming things. I've been working for the Forest Service for 11 years. Before that, I did a stint with search and rescue in the Cascades. And before that, I was just a kid who lived in the woods. I know how to read weather. I know how to move through dense forest without breaking my neck. I know the signs of genuine wilderness danger, rockfall, hypothermia, dehydration, disorientation. I know what a real animal attack looks like, and I know what bears do, and I know the difference between a wild dog and a coyote. I say this not to brag, but because it matters. I am not someone who spooks easily. I am not someone who mistakes shadows for threats. When you spend 11 years doing this job, you learn that most disappearances have a reasonable answer. The person didn't have the fitness they thought they had. The person underestimated elevation gain. The person ignored weather. The person went off trail and got disoriented. The person slipped. Someone fell down a ravine and their family never found the body. These things are sad, and they happen regularly, and they are explainable. The wilderness is dangerous. We tell people that. They don't listen, and we find their remains, or we don't, and the case closes with a reasonable conclusion. But there are trails where the answers stop making sense. I first became aware of something being fundamentally wrong about 8 years into my career. It was late September. The weather had been unusually cool, and the aspens were already turning. I was stationed at a small ranger station about 18 miles from the nearest town, responsible for maintenance patrols on something like 230 miles of trail. Most of my days were routine, checking bridges for deterioration, clearing deadfall from hiking routes, responding to permit questions, updating trail condition reports. There was a particular section of trail in the northeast quadrant of my district called Kettle Creek Trail. It was a moderate hike, maybe 6.5 miles round trip, popular with families and casual hikers. It followed a creek for most of the route and connected to several other trails higher up in the basin. The trail had been maintained regularly for at least 30 years. It showed up on every official map. The ranger station had a stock of permits and information sheets specifically for it. On a Thursday morning, early autumn, I went out for a routine maintenance inspection. This was something I did every other week during the season. You look for hazards, you note any maintenance issues, you check the water crossings. You also get a feeling for whether anything unusual has happened on the trail. The weather that morning was clear and cool. I started at the trailhead parking area around 8 in the morning. There were already 2 cars there, which was normal for that time of year. A family with kids, most likely. I marked my location and started up the trail, doing the standard walkthrough. For the first 3 miles, everything was normal. The trail was in good condition. There was normal foot traffic, some horse traffic. The creek was low but flowing normally. I didn't see anything that required maintenance. The forest was doing what it always does, growing, shading, persisting. But when I reached the mile marker for the 3-mile point, I noticed something that didn't seem significant enough at the time to even make a note of it. The forest had gone quiet. Not the way forests go quiet when a big animal has passed through. That kind of silence lasts 30 seconds, maybe a minute. This was different. This was the kind of silence where even the birds aren't calling, where the sound of your own breathing becomes very present. I stood for a moment and listened, and the quiet pressed down like something with weight. I've learned since then that this is one of the markers, one of the signs. I marked the location and continued. The quiet persisted as I moved deeper into the trail, which wasn't normal. Normally, forest sounds resume pretty quickly. You'll hear jays again, maybe a squirrel, the small anonymous rustles of wildlife. This silence was continuous and deliberate. I remember thinking that maybe there was a mountain lion nearby, which could cause this kind of effect. But I hadn't seen any recent sign of one. No scat, no kill sites, nothing. And mountain lions don't cause silence so complete that even the wind in the trees seems to stop. I finished my patrol, heading back down the trail at a faster pace than I'd gone up. I didn't feel in danger, exactly, but I felt watched in a way I couldn't articulate. It was the kind of feeling that makes you aware of exactly how isolated you are, and how far from any kind of help. When I got back to the trailhead parking area, the same 2 cars were still there. I made a note about the unusual silence at the 3-mile marker, filed it in the digital log, and didn't think much more about it. For the next 2 weeks, I maintained my regular patrol schedule. I didn't go back to Kettle Creek. There was too much other trail to cover, and I'm on a rotation system anyway. But other rangers or maintenance crews would cover those miles. That's how the system works. The next time I heard about Kettle Creek Trail was October 12th. I remember the date because my supervisor called me directly instead of sending an email, which meant something official had happened. A day hiker named Michael Brennan had gone missing. He'd started on Kettle Creek Trail in the morning, told his girlfriend he'd be back by early evening, and never showed up at their camp. The girlfriend had waited at the parking area for several hours before calling the ranger station. By the time dispatch reached us, it was nearly sunset. By the time I got to the location, it was fully dark. I remember the girlfriend's name was Sarah. She was probably 28 or 30, intelligent, not panicked but deeply worried. She told me that Michael was experienced. He'd backpacked before. He knew how to hike. He had a charged phone, water, good shoes. There was no reason for him not to have returned. How long has he been missing? I asked. About 4 hours now, since he left this morning around 9. 4 hours is not that long. At 4 hours, missing person statistics still favor a simple explanation. He'd turned an ankle. He decided to go farther than he planned. He'd gotten turned around. But Sarah was certain something was wrong. He said he'd be back by 5 at the latest, she said. It's only a 6-mile round-trip trail. He's not a solo backpacker. He wouldn't camp overnight without telling me. My supervisor was pulling together a search team, but it would take time. It was too dark to do an effective trail search, and that would be dangerous. The protocol was to wait until first light, set up a search grid, bring in dogs if necessary, and do a proper sweep. I asked Sarah a series of standard questions, exactly what he was wearing, his physical condition, whether he had any medical issues, whether there was any possibility he'd gone to meet someone else. All the answers came back normal. Michael sounded like exactly the kind of person who doesn't get lost and doesn't just disappear. I stayed with Sarah that night at the trailhead. I showed her the safety information, the permit logs, the trail maps. I explained how searches work, how likely it was that we'd find him quickly. She mostly sat in her car while I did paperwork and monitored the radio, waiting for dawn. First light search began at 6 in the morning. We had 12 people, a German Shepherd trained for lost person work, and a helicopter on standby. The team split into groups and started at the trailhead, with the dog handler taking the lead on the main trail. The procedure is systematic. You move slowly, you call the person's name, you look for any sign of them. Disturbed brush, clothing, equipment, a body. The dogs are incredibly good at this. If someone is in the forest and alive, a good search dog will usually find them. I was in the first group with the dog handler, moving up the main trail. The dog, A German Shepherd named Gus was on lead. Gus was a well-trained dog, had handled 50-plus searches, had a good record of finds. But something about that morning seemed to be affecting him. He was unusually tense, his ears back slightly, his enthusiasm muted. We moved up the trail, calling Michael's name. For the first 2 miles, nothing. Standard forest, no sign of the missing hiker. The dog was moving, but sluggishly. By mile 3, the forest had gone quiet again. That same complete absence of sound. The dog handler, a woman named Patricia, who I'd worked with before, felt it too. I could see it in her posture. She said, quietly, "That's not normal." "No," I said. "Gus doesn't like it either." The dog had actually stopped. He was standing in the middle of the trail, facing forward, but looking deeply uncertain. A lost person search dog is trained to move forward, to follow a track, to commit to a direction. A search dog's job is to deal with difficult conditions. But Gus didn't want to move forward. He wanted to go back. Patricia tried to coax him forward, but he resisted, not dramatically. Just a steady, absolute refusal to continue up the trail. We radioed back to the incident commander, and after some discussion, we decided to stay at our current location and let the second team, who was checking a different route higher up, have the lead position. Patricia and I started a detailed search of the area around us, looking for any sign of Michael. A shoe, a piece of equipment, anything that might have come off him. That's when we found the first thing. It was about 40 meters off trail, in a direction that made no sense for someone trying to hike. The forest to the right of the trail was thick, with dense brush and lots of fallen timber. Michael would have had to struggle through this without benefit of a trail. But there, hanging from a low branch about 8 feet off the ground, was a baseball cap. It was Michael's. Sarah confirmed it later. A blue cap with a logo she'd bought him. It was hanging on the branch in a way that suggested someone had deliberately placed it there. Not dropped it, placed it. The cap was dry, showing no sign of the overnight cold or dew. It was positioned so that you'd find it if you went far enough off trail and looked up. This was my first real piece of evidence that something was wrong. Not just unusual, but wrong. We photographed the cap, documented the location, bagged it carefully. Patricia looked at me, and I saw something shift in her professional composure. She knew something about this case that didn't add up. The search continued through the day with no further finds. The helicopter came and did sweeps of the surrounding area. The second team covered the upper reaches of the trail system. By evening, we had searched nearly 8 miles of trail and found nothing except the cap, which sat in an evidence bag in my ranger station. That night, the search was expanded. More teams came from adjacent districts. The dogs were brought out again. Helicopter time was extended. This is the point where a missing person case starts to feel serious at an organizational level. The Forest Service doesn't just let a missing hiker disappear without a full response. By day 3 of the search, we had covered over 20 miles of trail, including areas that Michael would have had no reason to visit. The search dogs had found nothing. The helicopter had found nothing. There was no body, no equipment, no sign of a fall or injury. There was only the cap, hanging in the trees like a question. By day 5, the search was being downsized. This is the reality of missing person searches. You can't sustain full teams indefinitely. The probability of finding someone alive after 5 days in the forest drops significantly. The search becomes recovery-focused rather than rescue-focused. And after 10 days, with no new evidence, searches are typically suspended. Sarah stopped coming to the trailhead after day 6. The last I heard, she went home to Portland and never came back. Michael Brennan was listed as missing. A ranger's report was filed. The case was classified as ongoing, which is Forest Service language for, "We don't know what happened, and neither does anyone else, but we're not closing it." The ranger station received a copy of the incident summary. I filed it with the other documentation. Life went on. But I had started paying closer attention to Kettle Creek Trail. Over the next few months, I made a point of doing maintenance patrols more frequently than was strictly necessary. I told myself this was professional diligence. The trail had had an incident. It made sense to monitor it. But honestly, I was beginning to suspect that whatever had happened to Michael Brennan wasn't an isolated event. I spent time in the ranger station archives, looking at old incident reports. Most of what I found was routine: sprains, one case of acute altitude sickness, a teenager with a panic attack on the trail. But there were a few odd entries. A missing person from 1993, last seen heading up Kettle Creek Trail, body never recovered. A hiker in 2001 who was found 2 miles off trail with no memory of how they got there. A report from 1987 noting that search dogs behaved erratically on the Kettle Creek route. These were scattered across decades. They didn't form an obvious pattern, but they were there. I also started asking other rangers, carefully, whether they'd experienced anything unusual in that area. Most of them were dismissive. I was a younger ranger compared to some of the old-timers, and I was asking about something that probably sounded paranoid. But one ranger, a man named Thomas, who'd been working the district for 24 years, agreed to talk with me off the record. Thomas told me about a rule. An old rule. It had been in place since at least the 1980s, and it had been passed down verbally between rangers. The rule was that no one was to patrol Kettle Creek Trail after sunset. It was in no manual. It was in no official policy. But multiple rangers across different decades had maintained this rule independently, which meant they'd learned it from someone else who also followed it. Why? I asked him. I don't know, Thomas said. I've never been told. I was told the rule my first week, and I followed it. And I've told every new ranger who works here to follow it. I figured I'd eventually find out why. But after 24 years, I still don't know. I just know that you don't go up that trail after dark. This should have bothered me more than it did. An oral tradition of avoiding an area, maintained for decades by rangers, based on no official documentation, was not normal protocol. But it made a kind of sense. If rangers had experienced something they couldn't explain, and they decided that the safest response was to avoid a particular place at a particular time, they might spread that rule informally rather than trying to explain it to bureaucrats. I started following the rule. No patrols on Kettle Creek after sunset. But other hikers didn't follow rules that didn't exist. In July of the following year, a group of 4 college students went missing from Kettle Creek Trail. They were doing an overnight backpacking trip, had told friends they'd return on a specific date, and simply didn't. The search for them was more extensive than the search for Michael Brennan, because there were more of them and because their family was very involved in push for resources. But the result was the same. Search dogs refused to go deeper into the trail. The helicopter found nothing. A ground search of the immediate area turned up some scattered equipment, but no sign of the people themselves. This time, I was more systematic about documenting what I found. The abandoned equipment was positioned in ways that seemed deliberate. A backpack hanging from a tree, a sleeping bag laid across a rock like someone had arranged it carefully, a tent set up but empty, a fire that had been cold for at least 2 days. The items didn't form a natural scatter pattern from a camp being disrupted. They were placed. I photographed everything. I documented GPS coordinates. I collected samples of fabric from the tent. I filed a detailed report. And I asked my supervisor if we could implement an official trail closure, at least temporarily. My supervisor was not receptive. We have no evidence that the trail is unsafe, he told me. A group of hikers disappeared, but that doesn't mean the trail caused it. They could have gotten lost. They could have gone off trail intentionally. Missing persons don't necessarily indicate hazardous trail conditions. I pushed back. It's the second incident in less than a year. And if you look at the historical data, there's a pattern going back decades. There's no pattern, he said. There are scattered incidents across 40 years. on a trail that thousands of people hike annually. You're seeing a connection because you're looking for one. Maybe I was, but I didn't believe that, and I don't think he did either. The 4 missing students were never found. Their names were Emma, David, Logan, and Keiko. I remember them specifically because I had to look at their photographs during the search briefings, and I kept them in my mind as I walked the trails, as a kind of ongoing acknowledgement of what had happened. That fall, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor I wanted to work a different district. I didn't explain why. I just said I thought it was time for a change. The request was denied. Staffing was tight. I was good at my job. They needed me in my current position, so I stayed. And I tried not to think about Kettle Creek Trail. But it's difficult not to think about something that has happened multiple times in the place where you work. Difficult not to wonder about the mechanisms behind it. Difficult not to develop a theory. Over the next year, I looked very carefully at the historical data, not just for Kettle Creek, but for the entire district. I compiled a list of all missing persons reports associated with any trail in the Ranger District going back to 1970. There were 62 of them. Of those 62, 9 had occurred on Kettle Creek Trail specifically. That's 14% of all missing persons cases on a trail that probably accounts for less than 5% of actual trail usage. But it's still a small number, still potentially explained by coincidence. What interested me more were the other patterns in the data. Missing persons on other trails in the district typically had one of 3 resolutions. The person was found alive, the person's remains were found, or the case was closed without explanation. The average time between disappearance and finding the person alive or deceased was 37 hours. But for missing persons in the Kettle Creek Trail vicinity, that number was different. 7 of the 9 cases that involved that trail or its environs were never resolved. No body, no remains, no evidence of where the person went. The 2 cases that were resolved both involved the hikers being found dead, and both times the deaths were attributed to exposure, which in one case didn't make sense because the hiker had full cold weather gear with them. It was as if the trail took some people and left others, and the taking was not necessarily fatal. Or if it was fatal, the deaths happened in a way that the forest didn't reveal. By this point in my service, I was approaching 9 years. With the Forest Service, I had developed what I thought was a reasonable working hypothesis. Something about the Kettle Creek Trail area caused people to vanish. Whether it was a person, a group of people, a large animal, or something else, I couldn't say. But the disappearances were not random. They didn't seem to be traditional predation. They were more like removal. I wanted to understand it. Not to stop it, although that would have been the obvious goal, but to understand it, because understanding is the first step toward dealing with any threat. So I made a decision that violated the informal rule I had been following, and that, I'm sure, violated some common sense. I went to Kettle Creek Trail after dark. This was in late August of my 10th year working in the district. The weather was stable. There was a nearly full moon. I told my supervisor I was checking on a maintenance issue that had been reported to me, and I'd be back before midnight. All of this was technically true, though I was being deliberately vague about which issue and which trail. I brought my Ranger patrol pack, including a headlamp, a radio, a knife, a whistle, and my sidearm, which I almost never carry but which I felt I needed that night. I arrived at the Kettle Creek trailhead at sunset, around 8:45 in the evening. The parking area was empty. No other cars, no other people. The forest was settling into that particular state that forests get at dusk, where the light becomes diffuse and everything takes on a kind of dimensionality it doesn't have during the day. I locked my Ranger truck and started up the trail. My headlamp was off. I was using the moonlight. The moon was bright enough that I could see the trail clearly, and I didn't want to restrict my peripheral vision with the narrow cone of a headlamp. For the first 2 miles, everything was normal. The trail felt like itself. normal forest, normal isolation, normal night sounds. I heard owls, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. My radio, set to the Ranger District frequency, produced occasional chatter from a dispatcher or another ranger checking in from somewhere else. By mile 3, I started noticing that the chatter on the radio had become less frequent. The frequency seemed to be getting worse, or my radio was getting a weaker signal. This was not unusual in the mountains, but I noted it. I also noticed that the forest around me had started to change in a subtle way. The density of the trees seemed greater, even though I was on an established trail that was theoretically maintained and therefore open. There were more fallen logs, more thick brush pushing up to the edge of the trail. It was as if the forest was gradually reclaiming the trail, even though I knew it had been maintained as recently as the previous month. I stopped and stood for a long moment, just listening. The forest was quiet again. That particular quality of quiet that I'd experienced before, where the normal ambient sounds of wilderness wind, rustling, distant water all seemed to fade into a deliberate silence. I did something that I don't recommend and that I can't fully explain, I called out. "Is there anyone here?" I said to the darkness. The response was immediate, not verbal, but immediate. The forest around me suddenly felt occupied in a way it hadn't before. The silence didn't end exactly, but it became a different kind of silence, an attentive silence. I turned my headlamp on, suddenly not comfortable with my vision being restricted to the moonlight. The beam of the headlamp moved across the trail in front of me, illuminating about 20 feet of path before the darkness swallowed the light again. There was nothing there, no one, no animal. But I was not alone. I don't know how to describe this feeling more accurately than that. I was being watched by something that was not visible, something that was aware of me, something that had reacted to my calling out. I moved forward on the trail, keeping my headlamp on, moving faster than I had been. My plan had been to go another mile or so to the location where Michael Brennan's cap had been found, but my confidence in this plan was evaporating rapidly. Behind me, from the direction I'd come, I heard footsteps. Not the sound of branches breaking under heavy weight. Actual footsteps, like someone walking deliberately on the trail, like someone following me. I spun around. My headlamp caught nothing. The trail behind me was empty, but the footsteps were still there, moving at the same speed I was moving, maintaining the same distance from me. When I walked faster, they walked faster. When I stopped, they stopped. I turned around again and started walking downhill at a faster pace. The footsteps matched me, not hurrying, not trying to close distance, just maintaining their position, about 30 feet back. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Harrow. I'm on Kettle Creek Trail, mile marker 4. I have an unknown subject following me on the trail. I'm proceeding downhill to the trailhead." There was a delay, longer than there should have been. "Copy, Ranger Harrow. Describe the subject." "I don't have a visual. They're maintaining distance, following me on the trail." Another delay. "Ranger Harrow, I'm not picking up anyone in your district on the communication network. You're alone up there." But I wasn't alone. The footsteps were still there. "I can hear them on the trail," I said. "Copy. Proceeding to your location with Deputy Nash. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes was too long." I decided I was not waiting for backup. I increased my pace to what was close to jogging, despite the fact that jogging on a downhill trail at night with a headlamp is a recipe for a serious injury. But I was concerned that stopping to wait was not an option. The footsteps behind me didn't jog. They maintained a steady pace, like someone who knew they didn't need to hurry. It took me about 12 minutes to get back to the trailhead. I was breathing hard, my heart rate was elevated, and I was experiencing a level of fear that I had not felt since a mountain lion had crossed my path early in my career. I got to my ranger truck, locked the doors, and waited for Deputy Nash. The deputy arrived about 5 minutes later. I told him what I'd experienced, and I watched his expression shift through several phases: skepticism, concern, and finally, something like recognition. "You heard footsteps," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And your radio said no one was on the frequency in your district." "Yes." Nash was quiet for a moment. "You're the third ranger to tell me that story," he said. "Over my 20 years working this county. Exactly that story. Someone goes on that trail at night. Someone hears footsteps. The radio acts weird. No one ever gets hurt, but everyone gets scared." "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I've gone up there looking for whatever is doing this. I've never found anything. No camps, no vehicles, no equipment. I've never encountered whatever is causing people to disappear or to hear things. But I know it's there." We went back to the trailhead together and did a careful search of the parking area and the first quarter-mile of trail, using flashlights to illuminate the ground. We found nothing. No vehicle that didn't belong there, no evidence of anyone having approached the area. Nash suggested that I shouldn't patrol Kettle Creek Trail alone anymore. He said if I needed to check on something in that area, I should arrange for backup. I agreed, but I knew that neither of us expected to do this. The ranger station would never officially acknowledge that there was a danger that required backup. It was too undefined, too difficult to write in a report. I went back to the ranger station and filed a report of what I'd heard. I was careful to be objective about it. I didn't claim to know what had happened. I simply documented that I had heard footsteps on the trail following me, and that the footsteps had no correlated movement on the ranger radio or any visual confirmation. I suggested that if there was someone camping illegally on the trail, they should be contacted and moved along. The report was filed. No investigation was initiated. Over the next year, I carefully avoided Kettle Creek Trail outside of necessary business. I continued my patrols, but only during daylight hours. I continued to follow the informal rule about not going there after dark. But something had shifted in my understanding. I had heard something on that trail that I couldn't explain, and I knew, with a certainty that I don't fully understand, that the thing making those footsteps was not a human being. Not entirely, not in any conventional sense. I also knew that other people had heard it too. The previous rangers before me, the search and rescue volunteers, possibly even the missing persons themselves, before they disappeared. And I knew that whatever it was not trying to kill me. It was curious, it was present, it was aware, but most importantly, it was still there. I'm now in my 11th year working for the Forest Service. The Kettle Creek Trail remains open to the public. The trail is maintained regularly. The Forest Service has no official acknowledgement that there is any problem with that trail or any safety concern that would warrant a closure. But if you hike on Kettle Creek Trail and you pay attention, you'll notice something. The trail maps that are distributed at the ranger station show Kettle Creek Trail as a loop that connects to 3 other trails in the basin. On the actual map, the official Forest Service map that we use in the field, that loop doesn't exist. The connection points are simply not marked. It's possible, if you go far enough, to reach those other trails from Kettle Creek. But the designated route stops about 1 mile before the connection point. No one has ever explained why the public map differs from the ranger map. I've also noticed that if you request a hiking permit for Kettle Creek Trail, the ranger at the station will ask you some questions. Where you're going, what time you're returning, how many people are in your group. And then, casually, they'll mention that the trail is best hiked during daylight hours. That weather can change quickly in the area. That you should definitely be off the trail by sunset. None of these warnings are in the official trail information. None of them are written down, but they're consistent. Every ranger, past and present, is passing on the same warning. In March of this year, another person went missing on Kettle Creek Trail, a young woman named Alexis Chen. She was an experienced hiker. She told her family she'd be back by evening, and she never returned. The search was thorough and found nothing. No body, no equipment, no evidence. The only unusual thing they found was a series of boot prints leading away from the trail into the dense forest that simply stopped. One boot print led into the undergrowth. The next print led into the undergrowth 300 feet away, as if someone had been transported between the 2 points. I'm not aware of the current status of Alexis Chen's case. I'm not told about these things officially. I just know they happen. I'm telling you this because I think you should understand something about the places you visit. When you see a trail that is maintained and marked, you assume it is safe. You assume that if there was a problem, there would be official warnings, that the government would close it, that experts would have figured out what was wrong. But sometimes the problem is too complex, too undefined, too impossible to explain in a way that doesn't sound like fiction. Sometimes people don't want to face what they're responsible for, so they maintain a system where the danger is communicated orally, through inaction, through absence of documentation. Sometimes the safest thing a ranger can do is pass on a rule that has no source. If you hike Kettle Creek Trail and a ranger casually suggests that you should be off the trail by sunset, listen to that suggestion. It's not a warning, it's something else. It's what we say when we can't say anything official. I don't know what lives in that forest. I don't know what takes people. I don't know if it's one thing or many things. I don't know if it's still there or if it comes and goes, but I know that it's real. I know that it's deliberate. I know that it's been there for at least 40 years, taking people at regular intervals, leaving behind evidence that's arranged like a question. And I know that every ranger who works this district will eventually learn the rule, pass it on to the next ranger, and go home wondering what they didn't stop. I still work this district. I still do my patrols. I still follow the rule about not going out after dark. But I'm no longer sure if the rule is meant to protect us from something in the forest, or if it's meant to protect something in the forest from being discovered. What I am sure of is this: some trails should stay lost. And if you ever see one that shouldn't be found, that's when you walk away. The footsteps I heard that night, they never got farther than 30 feet from me. They never tried to close that distance. But sometimes, late at night when I'm back at the ranger station, I can hear something on the empty radio frequency. It sounds like footsteps, coming closer, maintaining distance, patient. And I think about all the people who never came back. I think about the cap hanging in the tree. I think about the path that led nowhere. And I think about the unwritten rule that every ranger learns, and that no ranger can ever fully explain. The trail is still open. The forest is still there. And somewhere in that green darkness, something is still walking, still waiting, still taking things that don't belong to it, one person at a time, year after year, while we maintain our comfortable fiction that everything is managed and understood and safe. I'm David Harrow. I've been a park ranger in Idaho for 11 years, and I've never been able to explain what lives in that forest, but I know it's still there. I know it's still taking people. And I know the rule is there for a reason. Don't go there after dark. Since I filed that report about Alexis Chen, I've learned things that I probably shouldn't know. Things that came to me through channels that weren't official. A ranger from another district who called me. A deputy who mentioned something over coffee. An old Forest Service employee who retired 5 years ago and reached out after seeing my name connected to an incident report. What I've learned has made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about Kettle Creek Trail. The trail wasn't always closed to public use. Or rather, it was. But the closure was voluntary. In the early 1980s, there was a ranger named James Whitmore who worked this district. According to Thomas, the ranger who'd taught me the unwritten rule, Whitmore was the one who decided that the trail should not be patrolled after dark. He made this decision after an incident that was never formally documented. A ranger's daughter had been hiking on Kettle Creek Trail. She was in her early 20s, experienced, capable. She told her father she was doing a day hike. She said she'd be back by evening. She never returned. Whitmore spent 3 days searching for her personally. He didn't call for search and rescue immediately. Thomas said he just went into the forest alone, looking for her, covering miles of trail by himself. On the third day, he came back to the station and made a simple announcement. No one was to patrol Kettle Creek Trail after dark, effective immediately. No explanation was given. No incident report was filed, but the rule was passed down, ranger to ranger, for 40 years. I asked Thomas what happened to Whitmore's daughter. She was never found, he said. Her name was Margaret. Whitmore left the Forest Service about a year after she disappeared. He moved back east somewhere. No one here ever heard from him again. This was in the early 1980s. Margaret would be in her 60s now, if she were alive, if she'd survived whatever happened to her on that trail. I started thinking about the people who had disappeared from Kettle Creek Trail across the decades, not as individual incidents, but as a timeline, a pattern of taking. There was Margaret Whitmore in 1982, a missing hiker in 1993, 2 hikers in 2001, Michael Brennan in 2015, the group of 4 college students in 2016, and now Alexis Chen in 2024. That's 9 people across 42 years, an average of 1 person every 4.7 years. It was almost like a schedule, but there was something else I noticed when I looked at the data more carefully. The disappearances weren't evenly distributed. There were clusters. 1982 to 1993 was an 11-year gap. Then, 2001 to 2016 had 4 disappearances in 15 years. And then, 2024 was right on top of 2016. It was as if whatever was taking people had periods of activity and periods of dormancy, as if it had cycles. I shared this observation with Deputy Nash one afternoon when I stopped by the county sheriff's office to check on something. I brought a folder with my documentation, my analysis of the timeline, my notes on each case. Nash looked at the folder for a long time without opening it. "I appreciate you putting this together," he said finally. "But you should understand that if you present this analysis to anyone official, it's going to sound like you believe in something that doesn't exist. Doesn't it deserve investigation?" I asked. "It does," Nash agreed. "But not the kind of investigation that goes in a report. Not the kind that gets official attention. Because once it gets official attention, then it becomes a problem that someone has to solve. And no one knows how to solve it, so we just let it keep happening." Nash looked directly at me for the first time. "What would you do differently?" he asked. "If you could close Kettle Creek Trail tomorrow, would you? Would you tell people that there's something out there taking hikers, and we don't know what it is, but it's dangerous? How long before someone calls you a conspiracy theorist? How long before someone sues the Forest Service for closing a trail based on folklore? How long before it becomes a media circus? And every true crime podcast and paranormal investigator is camping in your district, trying to catch something on film?" He was right. The official silence wasn't incompetence, it was pragmatism. "And besides," Nash said, "closing the trail wouldn't stop it. It would just mean people disappeared off an officially closed trail, which would be even harder to explain." I understood what he was telling me. The system had decided that the best way to handle something inexplicable was to acknowledge it only through omission, to pass warnings through informal channels, to let each ranger learn the rule and make their own decision about what to believe. But that didn't stop me from investigating on my own. I started requesting old records, anything in the ranger station archives that related to incidents on Kettle Creek Trail. Most of what I found was routine. Trail maintenance logs, visitor permits, nothing remarkable. But I found something in a filing cabinet that had been marked inactive in the back of the station office. It was a folder labeled Kettle Creek Trail Incident Summary 19821992. The folder contained photocopies of incident reports, permit logs, and a handwritten summary. The summary was in Whitmore's handwriting, and it was dated 2 weeks before he left the Forest Service. Trail closure rationale, it said, based on pattern of incidents and ranger assessment. 4 disappearances in 10-year period. 2 confirmed search efforts resulted in no recovery. 3 unconfirmed sightings of unknown subject in vicinity of trail. Recommendation: restrict patrol access after sunset to prevent additional incidents. Basis: Forest Service officer discretion regarding ranger safety protocols. 4 disappearances. Only one of them was Margaret Whitmore. The others had been documented in the incident reports, but they were filed in a way that made them seem routine. A missing hiker here, an unfinished patrol there. Nothing that, taken individually, seemed connected. But Whitmore had connected them. He'd spent 10 years documenting something, and then he'd made a decision about how to handle it, and he'd left. The folder also contained something else. A hand-drawn map, obviously done by Whitmore himself, that showed the approximate locations of the disappearances. They didn't form a random scatter across the trail. They formed a line, a deliberate progression along the trail, moving deeper into the forest. Whitmore had noted something on the map. Small handwriting in the margins. Point of no return approximately mile 4.5. No recoveries beyond mile 4. All disappearances on Northern Circuit. I looked at that map for a very long time. Whitmore had identified something. He'd found a threshold. A point on the trail beyond which people didn't come back. I'd experienced something on the trail at roughly mile 3. The footsteps. The sense of being watched. If Whitmore was right, the actual threshold was about 1.5 miles farther. No ranger had gone that far since Whitmore had made his recommendation. We'd all decided, informally, that the rule was to not go at all after dark. But Whitmore's map suggested that the rule could be more specific. Don't go past mile 4.5 after dark. Don't go into the Northern Circuit after sunset. Maybe the trail before that point was safe. I'm explaining all of this context because I want you to understand that what I did next wasn't impulsive. It was research-based. It was deliberate. In late June of this year, I planned another expedition to Kettle Creek Trail after dark. But this time, I was going to go during the day first, to position equipment and establish a baseline. I told my supervisor I was doing a detailed maintenance inspection of the trail. I said I was documenting erosion patterns and needed photographs. This wasn't entirely a lie. I did want to document the trail thoroughly. I just had specific documentation goals in mind. I hiked Kettle Creek Trail in daylight on a Friday afternoon, equipped with a GPS unit, a camera, and my ranger pack. I documented the mile markers carefully. I took measurements of the trail width. I photographed sections of forest. And most importantly, I identified the exact location of mile 4.5, Whitmore's point of no return. Mile 4.5 was a significant transition point on the trail. The forest changed, the understory became denser, the canopy closed in more completely, and most noticeably, the trail itself became less distinct. It was still maintained, but you could see that more undergrowth was encroaching from the sides. At mile 4.8, I found something. It was on the trail itself, positioned carefully on a flat rock beside the path. It was a wooden sign, hand-carved, that said simply, "Return." The sign was weathered, but not ancient. I'd estimate it was maybe 10 to 15 years old, but it had been maintained. Someone was keeping this sign in place. someone who knew about Whitmore's point of no return and was reinforcing the warning. I photographed the sign. I noted the GPS coordinates, and I decided that I was not going farther up the trail that day. That night, back at the ranger station, I sat down and thought very carefully about what I wanted to do. My research had taken me to a place where I had to make a choice. I could either accept the rule, maintain the informal protocol, and let the mystery remain unsolved, or I could go beyond mile 4.5 at night and try to find evidence of what was actually happening on that trail. I spent most of the night thinking about the people who had disappeared. Michael Brennan, who had a girlfriend who never got answers. The group of 4 college students whose families had endured years of not knowing. Margaret Whitmore, who had vanished 42 years ago and had probably been given up for dead decades ago. And Alexis Chen, who had disappeared 6 months earlier and whose case was still open, still a source of pain for her family. I thought about what I owed to them. As a ranger, as someone who worked the trails where they disappeared, as someone who now knew there was a pattern. And I decided that the informal rule existed to protect me, but it also existed to protect something else. The thing on that trail had been operating with impunity for 42 years because no one had been willing to investigate it directly. Because everyone involved had decided that the safest thing was to acknowledge the threat only through silence. I decided that I was going to break the rule. I arranged it carefully. I told my supervisor I needed to check on a maintenance issue that had been reported on the northern section of the trail. I explained that I'd be hiking in at sunset and would be back by midnight. I said I was bringing my radio and my sidearm, which was highly unusual for a maintenance inspection, but which he didn't question. On the evening of June 28th, I drove to the Kettle Creek trailhead at around 6 in the afternoon. The weather was clear and stable. The moon was waxing, not yet full but bright enough to see by. I was as prepared as I could be for something that I couldn't prepare for. I had my headlamp, my radio, my sidearm, a knife, a whistle, a flashlight with extra batteries, a compass, a GPS unit, and my ranger pack with standard emergency supplies. I had told Deputy Nash where I was going, and I had arranged for him to do a welfare check on my truck at midnight. If I didn't call in by then, he would alert search and rescue. I started up the trail at 7 in the evening as the sun was setting behind the western ridge. For the first 3 miles, the trail was familiar to me. I'd walked this section many times. The forest was settling into that quiet state that forests get at dusk. No threatening silence yet, just the normal diminishment of daytime sounds. At mile 3, I felt the change. The forest shifted into that attentive quiet. The feeling of being watched. I pushed through it and kept moving. At mile 4, I had to make a choice. The trail continued deeper into the forest, toward that point of no return that Whitmore had identified. My headlamp was on now, cutting through the increasing darkness. My radio had been producing occasional chatter from other rangers in other districts, but that was fading to occasional check-ins. I pressed forward. At mile 4.5, I found the sign again. Return. It was still there, unmoved, since I'd seen it in daylight. I stood in front of it for several minutes, trying to convince myself that I was really going to do this. Then, I crossed the threshold. Immediately, everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It dropped at least 10 degrees in the space of a few meters. Not gradually, but sharply. One moment I was in relatively temperate forest. The next moment, I was in cold. Deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the evening temperature outside. The second thing I noticed was the sound. My radio, which had been producing normal ranger chatter, started producing nothing but static, not the static of a weak signal, perfect, even static, like white noise, like the radio had been tuned to nothing at all. The third thing I noticed was that the forest around me looked different. It was hard to articulate exactly how. The trees were the same species, the trail was still visible, but something about the light, or the density of the shadows, or the way the moonlight fell, made it seem like I was in a different place, an older place, a place that hadn't been visited in a very long time. I kept moving forward, following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest beyond the point of no return. At mile 4.8, I passed the wooden sign. I noted the GPS coordinates, mile 5.0, and the trail was becoming less distinct. I could see where it had been maintained, but also where the maintenance had stopped. This was the edge of the administered forest. Beyond here, the wilderness was no longer being managed. At mile 5.3, I found the first piece of evidence. It was a backpack, hanging from a low branch, the same way Michael Brennan's cap had been hanging in the trees. This pack was older, more faded. I estimated it was 15 to 20 years old. I documented it, photographed it, and carefully took it down to examine the contents. Inside the pack were personal items, a water bottle, a jacket, a map. The map was a Forest Service map from about 2005, based on the date printed on it. The pack itself had a name written on the inside in permanent marker, David Walters. I knew that name. David Walters was one of the missing hikers from 2005. He'd been missing for 19 years. His pack, according to the official search records, was never found. But here it was, hanging in a tree, dry and preserved, as if it had been placed there and maintained carefully to ensure it would be found. I was past the point of no return now, both physically and psychologically. I had evidence of something impossible. A backpack that was supposed to not exist, in a location that was supposed to be inaccessible, positioned as if it was waiting to be found. I kept moving. The trail was almost gone now. I was following what looked more like an animal path than a maintained hiking trail, but it was deliberate. Something had kept this path open. Something maintained it. At mile 5.8, I found a second backpack. This one was more recent, maybe 10 years old. Inside, I found a journal and personal effects. The name written inside was Emma Morrison, one of the 4 college students who had disappeared in 2016. Emma's journal was mostly empty, except for one entry, written on what appeared to be the night she disappeared. The trail keeps going. Everyone else went back, but I kept going. I wanted to see where it led. I shouldn't have. The footsteps started about an hour ago. They're behind me, but not behind me. I can't explain it. Like they're in the forest and also in my head. I think I'm lost. I think I've been lost for hours. The trees don't look like they did before. I'm going to try to go back, but I don't think I can find back. I don't think the trail goes back anymore. That was the last entry. I photographed the journal page. I documented the location. And I made the decision that I needed to go back. Not because I was afraid, although I was beginning to be afraid, but because I had what I needed. I had evidence. I had documentation of something that couldn't be explained by conventional means. But when I turned around to head back down the trail, I realized something that made my blood go cold. The trail that I had come up on was no longer visible. I was standing in the forest, with my headlamp cutting a narrow cone of light through darkness, and the trail had simply stopped being there. Behind me was dense, trackless forest. No path, no markers, no indication of which direction I'd come from. I checked my GPS unit. The device showed my coordinates clearly, showed the trail as a line on the map, showed my current position relative to the trailhead. According to my GPS, I was standing on the trail, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't walk it. This was when I understood what had happened to the missing people. The trail didn't disappear randomly. It disappeared when you crossed that threshold and kept going. It disappeared as a physical thing, but it remained in the GPS record. You could navigate by GPS, but you couldn't walk by sight. You were trapped in a place where technology said one thing and your senses said another. I pulled up the trail coordinates on my GPS and started walking in the direction the device indicated was back toward the trailhead. I was moving through forest, but I was trusting the GPS to keep me on the right path. I don't know how long I walked. Time moved strangely. My watch said it was only 8:45 when I checked it at what I thought was mile 5.3. But I felt like I'd been walking for much longer, like hours had passed. And then I heard the footsteps again, not behind me this time. Beside me, parallel to my path. Something was walking through the forest alongside me, maintaining a consistent distance, moving at the same speed. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Harrow. I'm on Kettle Creek Trail, and I have an unknown subject paralleling my position. I'm proceeding toward the trailhead. Static. Only static." My radio wasn't receiving anything but white noise. The thing beside me didn't try to intercept me, didn't try to close distance. It just kept pace, a presence in the darkness just beyond the reach of my headlamp. I kept walking, following my GPS, trusting the technology even though everything around me was telling me that technology was lying. At some point, gradually, I became aware that I was on a trail again. I could see it. The forest had opened up slightly. The canopy was less dense. The understory was thinner. I was moving back through the threshold without realizing it. My GPS showed I was at mile 4.6, just past Whitmore's point of no return, moving back toward the land of the living. The thing that had been beside me in the darkness was gone. When it had left, I couldn't say, but I was alone now. At mile 4.5, I found the sign again. Return. I had returned. At mile 4, the cold lifted. The forest returned to normal temperature. The feeling of being watched faded, but didn't entirely disappear. The forest was still attentive, still aware, but it was no longer focused on me with the intensity it had been. At mile 3, I felt the transition complete. The regular forest sounds started to resume. The oppressive silence lifted. I was back in the normal world. I made it to the trailhead at 9:42 in the evening. Deputy Nash was already there, sitting in his patrol car with the lights off. He'd come to do a wellness check and had arrived early. I was shaking. I was breathing hard. I must have looked like I'd been through something traumatic, because Nash immediately asked if I was hurt. I told him what I'd found. The backpacks, the journal, the footsteps, the trail disappearing, the walk back through darkness and GPS coordinates. Nash listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long time. "You shouldn't have gone past mile 4.5, he said finally. "I know, but I'm glad you did." Nash took the backpacks from me and the photograph of Emma's journal entry. He said he would file a report about the recovered equipment and that he would personally make sure the items were returned to the families of the missing people. "What do I put in the report?" I asked him. "The truth," Nash said. "You found equipment on the trail. You documented the location. You recovered the items and brought them out. That's all the report needs to say. People deserve to know what's actually happening out there." "Maybe," Nash said. "But knowing and proving are two different things. And I'm not sure the families need to know that their loved ones went into a place where the trail stops existing and where something else takes over. Sometimes the truth is crueler than not knowing." He was right, and I hated that he was right. Nash dropped me back at my truck, and I drove home in silence. I didn't file a report about what had happened. Neither did Nash. The equipment was returned to the families with a simple explanation. It had been found during a routine trail patrol. The backpacks had been in the forest for years, preserved by the dry conditions. That was all. The families got closure of a sort. They got to bury their loved ones, or at least to have something physical to mourn. But the trail remained unexplained. Since that night, I've been trying to process what I experienced, trying to rationalize it through conventional explanations, Mass delusion, equipment malfunction, a trick of my own mind, stressed by the atmosphere and the knowledge of missing people. But I don't believe those explanations. I know what I saw, I know what I found, and I know that there's a place on Kettle Creek Trail, past mile 4.5, where the rules of the normal world stop applying. I've thought about going back, about going past mile 5.8, going farther into the darkness, trying to find the actual source of whatever is doing this. But I've also thought about what happened to Emma, and David Walters, and Margaret Whitmore, and all the others. The smart choice is to stop investigating, to accept the rule, to pass it on to the next ranger the way it's been passed on to me, to let the mystery remain unsolved, and to acknowledge it only through silence and inaction. But I want you to know something, even though I can't explain it. On certain nights when I'm back at the ranger station doing paperwork late, I can hear something on the emergency radio frequency. It's not a voice, it's not words, it's a pattern of static, almost like Morse code, but not quite. Like something is trying to communicate through the white noise, but can't quite make itself understood. And sometimes, when I hear it, I think about Emma's last journal entry, about how the footsteps were behind me, but not behind me, how she could hear them in the forest, and also in her head. I think about what would happen if someone spent enough time past mile 4.5. If they went far enough into that place where the trail stops being a physical thing, would they be able to come back? Or would they stay there, part of that in-between space, unable to communicate, unable to leave, but still present in some form? Would they become like the footsteps? Like the presence that matches your pace through the darkness? I've considered that maybe the thing on Kettle Creek Trail isn't taking people. Maybe it's keeping them, preserving them in some form that's caught between our world and another world, maintaining the trail for them in a way by keeping it partly accessible. I don't know. I'm a park ranger, not a theoretical physicist or a paranormal investigator. I don't have answers. I just have questions. But I do know this: the rule exists for a reason. The informal prohibition against patrolling that trail after dark is not arbitrary. It's the result of 42 years of accumulated experience and accumulated loss. It's the result of people who have gone into that place and come back changed, who have decided that the safest response is to warn the next person without actually explaining what the warning is for. When I train new rangers, I will pass on the rule. I will tell them that Kettle Creek Trail should not be patrolled after sunset. I won't explain why. I'll let them figure it out on their own, the way I did. And maybe they'll accept it and maintain the informal protocol. Or maybe they'll do what I did and investigate. But either way, the rule will persist. Because some knowledge, once acquired, can't be unacquired. And the safest place for that knowledge is in silence. I'm still a ranger. I still love this work. I still believe in the mission of protecting the forest and keeping people safe. But I also know that some parts of the forest are not ours to protect. Some parts belong to something else. And the most protection we can offer is to acknowledge that and to warn people without saying why. If you ever find yourself on a trail where a ranger casually mentions that you should be back by sunset, listen to that advice. Don't ask why. Don't investigate. Don't cross the threshold, because once you do, the rules change. The trail becomes something else, and the footsteps start behind you, and then they're beside you, and then they're everywhere at once, and you find yourself in a place where GPS says one thing and your senses say another, and you're not sure which one is lying. That place is still out there, and something in that place is still waiting, still taking what wanders too far, still maintaining its domain, and still, every few years, reminding us that the wilderness has rules that we never wrote, and that some trails should never be fully explored. I'm David Harrow. I've been a park ranger in Idaho for 11 years, and I know there are places in this forest that should stay hidden. For everyone's sake, they should stay hidden. I want to add something else, something that I didn't include in my initial account because I wasn't sure it was relevant, or because I was still processing it myself. About 2 months after I recovered the backpacks from past mile 4.5, I received a phone call. It was from a woman named Catherine Brennan, Michael Brennan's sister. She'd seen a Forest Service report about recovered equipment from Kettle Creek Trail, and she'd put together that the backpacks might be related to her brother's disappearance. Catherine had been searching for answers about Michael for 9 years. She'd done everything a family can do, hired private investigators, reached out to missing persons organizations, maintained a social media presence for the case, kept pressure on the sheriff's office to keep looking. But after 9 years, the case had gone cold. She'd called me, hoping that I could give her more information than what was in the official report. I told her what I could tell her. That equipment had been found on the trail during a routine patrol, that we were investigating how it came to be where it was, that we were working to determine if it was connected to her brother's disappearance. What I didn't tell her was where I'd found it. What I didn't tell her was what I'd experienced. What I didn't tell her was that her brother had probably gone past mile 4.5 and that there was no good explanation for where he'd been or what had happened to him. But Catherine was smart. She asked the right questions. The backpacks were found on the trail? She asked. Yes. Why would equipment from 9 years ago still be there? Why hadn't anyone found it before? The trail is large. Equipment can be easily missed, but your report says the equipment was preserved. Dry, in good condition. How does equipment stay dry and well preserved for 9 years in a forest? I didn't have a good answer for that. Catherine told me something that I've been thinking about ever since. She said that in the years after Michael disappeared, she'd received several strange phone calls. Someone would call the house, usually late at night, and all that would be on the line was static. Not dead air, actual static, like a radio tuned between stations. It would last for 30 seconds to a minute, and then whoever was calling would hang up. This happened over the course of several years, 20 or 30 calls, always from an unregistered number, always late at night, always just static. Do you think it was Michael? I asked her. I don't know, she said, but I think someone was trying to communicate, and I think they were trying to tell me that he was still somewhere, still trying to reach us. I didn't tell her about the static on my Ranger radio. I didn't tell her that I'd heard the same pattern of Morse code-like sounds. But she'd already made the connection anyway. You've heard it too, she said. It wasn't a question. I've heard things I can't explain, I admitted. Catherine asked me if I would be willing to meet with her and 2 other families of missing persons. Families whose loved ones had disappeared from Kettle Creek Trail or surrounding trails in the Ranger District. She said they wanted to share information, to see if there were patterns that the official investigations had missed. I agreed, though I wasn't sure it was a good idea. We met in a coffee shop in the town nearest to the Ranger District, about 30 miles from my station. There were 4 families present. Catherine Brennan, representing Michael. A couple named the Morrisons, whose son David had disappeared in 2005. A woman named Susan Chen, Alexis Chen's mother. And an older man named Frank Whitmore, who turned out to be a nephew of James Whitmore, the ranger who had worked the district 40 years ago. Frank had come because he'd inherited some of his uncle's papers when James passed away 15 years ago. He'd kept them in a box, unsure what to do with them. But after hearing that I'd recovered equipment from the trail, he thought it was time to share what his uncle had documented. Frank brought out a collection of handwritten journals. James Whitmore had kept detailed records of his observations of Kettle Creek Trail, not in an official capacity, but personal notes, documentation of his own investigation into what was happening. I sat and read through years of Whitmore's handwriting. His observations echoed mine exactly. The silence on the trail, the feeling of being watched, the way search dogs refused to go deeper, the disappearances that had no logical explanation, the deterioration of his attempts to investigate it himself. But Whitmore had gone farther than I had. He'd interviewed people. He'd researched the history of the area. He'd looked into whether there had been disappearances on the same trails before they were officially part of the ranger system. What Whitmore had discovered was that Kettle Creek Trail and the surrounding forest had a long history of disappearances going back centuries. Local indigenous peoples had stories about the area. Trails were avoided. Certain locations were not traveled after dark. There were warnings passed down through oral tradition about a place in the forest where the rules were different. When European settlement had come to the area, those warnings had been lost or ignored. A new trail system had been built, including what became Kettle Creek Trail, and the disappearances had continued, though now they were documented as missing hikers rather than being understood as part of a larger pattern. Whitmore had tried to compile a comprehensive history. He'd requested old Forest Service records, had interviewed previous rangers, had done genealogical research on some of the families involved. What he'd concluded was that the disappearances were consistent, predictable, and impossible to stop or prevent. He also concluded something else, something that he'd written in his final journal entry, dated 1 week before he left the Forest Service. The thing on the trail is not hostile. That is the wrong way to think about it. It is not predatory in the sense that a mountain lion is predatory. It is acquisitive. It collects things. It has been collecting things from this forest for longer than we have been here. And it will continue to collect things long after we are gone. The only question is whether we acknowledge this and warn people, or whether we pretend that our trail system is safe and let the collection continue in silence. I have decided to leave. I cannot be the person responsible for maintaining a lie that comprehensive, but I also cannot be the person who tries to stop it. Some things are beyond the scope of what a human being can address. So I will leave, and I will pass on a rule, and I will hope that whoever comes after me understands that the rule exists because we have failed. We have failed to keep people safe, and we will continue to fail. But at least we can warn them, even if the warning is unspoken. Reading that, I understood Whitmore's resignation in a way I hadn't before. He hadn't left because he was afraid. He left because he had accepted something that he couldn't accept as an official representative of the government. I shared some of this information with the families, but not all of it. I told them about the equipment I'd found, about the condition it was in, about the strange nature of how it was preserved. I told them what I could tell them without sounding like I was describing something impossible. Susan Chen asked me directly, "Is my daughter still alive?" I didn't know how to answer that. Based on my experience, based on what I'd witnessed, I didn't think Alexis Chen was alive in any conventional sense. But I also didn't think she was dead. I thought she was in that in-between place, trapped in the space where the GPS coordinates said one thing, and the physical forest said something else. "I don't know," I said finally. "But I know she was there. I have evidence that your daughter went farther on that trail than we thought. And I have evidence that the trail itself is not what it seems." Frank Whitmore shared more of his uncle's journals. James had documented one particular theory that had consumed the last years of his work with the Forest Service. He had begun to believe that Kettle Creek Trail was not just a place where people disappeared, but a place where something was actively managing a boundary. "The trail is a threshold," James had written. "On one side is the normal forest, with normal rules, where hikers can come and go freely. On the other side is a place that operates under different principles, and something on that trail is maintaining that boundary, deciding who crosses it, deciding what stays and what comes back. Like a gatekeeper, like a guardian, or a jailer, depending on your perspective." James had even tried to communicate with whatever was on the trail. He'd left offerings, food, objects, written messages. He'd tried to establish some kind of understanding or negotiation. According to his journals, some of his offerings were taken. Some were left undisturbed. Some were found arranged in patterns that suggested intentional response. One particular entry described an offering that James had left at mile 4.5, near the point of no return. A compass, a map, and a request, written on paper, asking for the safe return of the missing people. According to the entry, he'd left these items in the afternoon. When he returned the next morning, the compass and map were gone. The paper with his request had been left behind, but it had been marked with a response. Someone or something had written one word on the paper, in handwriting that was not James's own: no. I read that entry 3 times. I looked at the photocopy of the paper that Frank had brought. The word no was written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Not angry or violent, just firm, a statement of refusal. Whatever was on that trail had responded to Whitmore's attempt at negotiation. It had taken his offerings, but rejected his request. It had communicated, in the most basic way possible, that it would not return what it had taken. My uncle left after that, Frank told me. He decided that he couldn't negotiate with something he didn't understand. He decided that the only ethical choice was to leave and to pass on a warning. We sat with that information for a while. The families understood, I think, that their loved ones were not coming back, that they would not be found, that the closure they'd been seeking was not available. But they also had something they didn't have before. Confirmation that the disappearances were not random accidents. Confirmation that their loved ones had been taken by something deliberate. Confirmation that at least their deaths or disappearances meant something, even if that something was incomprehensible. I made a decision that day. I told the families that I would continue to investigate Kettle Creek Trail within the bounds of my official capacity as a ranger. I would document any new incidents. I would recover any equipment that was found. I would work to build a more complete historical record of what had happened on that trail. But I would do it quietly. I would do it without making official accusations or claims that couldn't be proven. I would work within the system of silence that had been established, but I would work to maintain a record of the truth beneath that silence. Since that meeting, I've been more systematic in my documentation. I've created a comprehensive incident database, cross-referenced with historical records, that details every disappearance, every strange occurrence, every piece of evidence that I can connect to Kettle Creek Trail. The database shows something interesting when you look at it as a whole. The disappearances are not random in their timing. They cluster around certain seasons, certain times of day. They're more likely to occur when the moon is waxing or full. They're more likely to occur when the weather is clear and stable. They're more likely to occur when someone hikes past mile 4.5 after sunset. But they also occur according to a deeper pattern, a rhythm, a cycle that's not based on the human calendar, but on something else. Something that takes a person every 4 to 6 years, give or take. Something that is patient and consistent and inevitable. I've also documented something else. In the years since I began paying attention, there have been 5 more disappearances connected to Kettle Creek Trail. 5 people who went on a hike and didn't come back. All of them occurred in ways that matched the pattern. Clear weather, evening hikes, young people, mostly, people with enough confidence to ignore informal warnings. And in each case, equipment has been found subsequently, positioned carefully, preserved, like offerings left at an altar, or warnings to the next person who passes. I've recovered 3 more backpacks, 2 hiking boots, and 1 jacket. Each contained personal effects that I've carefully documented and eventually returned to families. Each told the story of someone who had gone farther than they should have and had not come back. 1 backpack, recovered from mile 6.2, contained a hiking journal that had belonged to a young woman named Lisa Sanderson. She'd disappeared in 2022. The final entry in her journal read, "I can see lights ahead, between the trees, like campfires, but wrong. The color is wrong. They're purple and green, and colors I don't have names for, and I know I shouldn't go toward them. I know that everything about this is wrong, but I also know that if I don't go toward them, I'll be lost here forever. At least the lights are a destination. At least there's something to walk toward. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to find out what's making those lights, because not knowing is worse than knowing something terrible. That was the last entry. The lights she described are something I've heard about from other hikers who've reported strange sightings near Kettle Creek Trail. Unexplained lights in the forest, colors that shouldn't be visible in natural light, phenomena that appear after dark and disappear when you try to get closer to them. I've never seen them myself, but I've tracked reports of them going back decades in ranger station logs and visitor incident reports. They're a consistent phenomenon, part of the overall pattern. I think they might be what draws people farther into the forest, what makes them ignore the informal warnings, what makes them cross mile 4.5, even when every instinct should be telling them to turn back. I think they might be bait. Frank Whitmore and I have stayed in touch since that first meeting with the families. He's been digitizing his uncle's journals and has shared them with me. I've been able to fill in gaps in the historical record using James's documentation. Together, we've compiled a much more complete picture of what Kettle Creek Trail is and what has been happening there. Frank has also done research into the indigenous history of the area. He found that the local tribes had specific names and stories for the place. They called it the Taking Path. According to their oral traditions, it was a place where something lived that took travelers. The tribes had protocols for avoiding it. They traveled in groups. They never traveled at night. They left offerings at specific locations to satisfy whatever lived there. When the European settlers came and established the Ranger District, they had no knowledge of these traditions. The indigenous peoples were no longer in control of the land. And the taking continued, now documented as missing hikers, now explained away as accidents or misadventure. But the pattern persisted. The taking path kept taking, regardless of whether anyone understood what it was doing or why. I've thought a lot about what Whitmore concluded. That the thing on that trail is not hostile, but acquisitive. That it's a collector. That it has been collecting from this forest long before we had trails. And it will keep collecting long after we're gone. I've also thought about what that means for the people who live nearby, for the visitors who hike these trails, for the rangers like me who are responsible for maintaining them. If we can't stop the taking, then what's the ethical response? Do we close the trail? Do we admit publicly that there's a danger we can't explain? Do we let the mystery remain hidden? I've come to believe that the system of silence is the least harmful option, even though I hate that I believe that. Because the alternative public acknowledgement of something we can't explain, can't predict, can't prevent, would cause a different kind of damage. It would destroy confidence in the rangers and the Forest Service. It would invite investigation and speculation that wouldn't help anyone. It would turn a private mystery into a public panic. So the rule persists, unofficial but universal. Don't go to Kettle Creek Trail after dark. Don't ignore the casual warning that a ranger gives you. Don't cross mile 4.5 if you do hike the trail. Don't assume that you're the exception, because you're not. The taking path takes from all of us equally, given the opportunity. I'm coming up on 12 years with the Forest Service now. I've been thinking about what comes next. Whether I want to stay in this job, in this district, maintaining this silence. Whether I want to retire like Whitmore did and leave the burden to someone else. But I think I'll stay. Because someone needs to maintain the record. Someone needs to know that the disappearances are real. Someone needs to track the pattern and make sure that the informal warnings continue to be passed down. And because walking away feels like abandoning the people who are still out there, in that place past mile 4.5, in that in-between space where GPS says one thing and your senses say something else, I don't think Michael Brennan and David Walters and Emma Morrison and the others are dead. I think they're still there, trapped in whatever exists beyond the threshold, conscious and aware, but unable to communicate, unable to return. And sometimes, when I hear the static on my Ranger radio late at night, I think I hear them trying to say something, trying to reach back to the world they left behind. I can't help them. I've accepted that. Whatever took them also keeps them. And there's no negotiation to be done with something like that. But I can maintain the warning. I can pass on the rule. I can tell the next ranger, and the ranger after that Kettle Creek Trail should not be walked after dark. That mile 4.5 is a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. That the silence at the trail is a sign of something's attention, and that attention should be avoided. I can do that much. I will do that much. Because some trails, in the end, are not for hiking. Some trails are for something else entirely. Some trails maintain their own purposes, independent of our use of them. And the only ethical thing we can do is respect that, even in silence, even in not knowing. The trail is still open. The Forest Service maintains it. Hikers still use it. Every few years, someone follows it too far, or stays too late, or ignores the casual warnings that rangers give, and the taking continues. It will continue after I'm gone. It will continue as long as the trail exists, and as long as people choose to walk it. Some things, once they start, don't stop. They just persist, like gravity, like weather, like the slow growth of trees in the darkness. I'm David Harrow. I've been a park ranger in Idaho for 12 years now, and I know that some knowledge, once acquired, becomes a burden that you carry to your grave. The trail is still there. The thing on the trail is still there. And the rule, unspoken but absolute, still persists. Don't go there after dark. And if you do, if you find yourself farther than you should be, past mile 4.5, hearing footsteps that aren't your own, seeing lights that have no source, just know that you're not lost. You've been found. And the taking has already begun. I need to tell you about the most recent thing that happened, because I think it's important that you understand this is not a historical mystery. This is not a closed case file. This is something that is still occurring, still taking people, still maintaining its boundary. 3 weeks ago, a young man named Jason Wheeler went missing from Kettle Creek Trail. He was 23 years old. He was hiking with his girlfriend, and she stayed at the trailhead while he did a solo walk that he said would take about 3 hours. He never came back. The search was initiated immediately. We brought in dogs. We brought in teams. We searched the trail thoroughly, all the way past mile 4.5 this time, since we now know that's where the real danger zone begins. We found nothing, no sign of Jason, no equipment, no indication that he had ever been on the trail at all. His girlfriend, a woman named Rachel, was devastated. She told us that Jason had been insistent about doing this hike. He'd read about Kettle Creek Trail online. He'd seen the reviews. He knew it was popular. He wanted to experience it for himself. Rachel mentioned something to me that I found significant. She said that in the days before the hike, Jason had been hearing strange sounds on his phone. Static interruptions. Moments where his calls or messages would be disrupted by what sounded like white noise or radio interference. He'd thought it was a phone problem and was planning to get it repaired. I recognized that description immediately. I told Rachel what I could tell her, which was very little. I said that we would continue searching. I said that we would file reports and keep the case open. I said that we would do everything we could, but I didn't tell her what I believed. That Jason Wheeler had probably heard the footsteps on that trail. That he had probably seen the lights between the trees. That he had probably made the decision to keep going, to see where the trail led, to understand what was happening in that place. and that he was probably still there, in that space between GPS coordinates and physical reality, in that place where the rules are different and the taking never stops. Rachel called me last week. She said she'd been receiving phone calls late at night. Just static. 30 seconds to a minute of static, and then the line would go dead. She said she thought it might be Jason trying to contact her, trying to reach back from wherever he was. I didn't confirm or deny that theory, but I didn't tell her she was wrong. I've been thinking about writing this account for a long time. I've been thinking about what I should share and what should remain private, what would help people and what would just create panic or speculation. I've decided that you deserve to know the truth. As much as I understand it, you deserve to know that there are places in the wilderness that are not entirely under human control, that there are phenomena that we cannot explain, that there are people who have disappeared and who are not coming back, but who are also not entirely gone. You deserve to know that the rangers and the Forest Service know this, and that we maintain a system of silence about it, because the alternative is worse. But I also want to tell you something else, something that I've come to understand through all of this. The thing on Kettle Creek Trail is not evil. I don't think it's motivated by malice or hunger or any recognizable human emotion. I think it simply exists. It takes things because that is what it does. It collects from the forest the way the forest collects nutrients from fallen trees and decaying leaves. In a strange way, I think the people who disappear become part of something larger. They become part of the forest itself, or part of whatever exists in that space beyond mile 4.5. They stop being separate from the wilderness and become integrated with it. I know that sounds like rationalization. I know it sounds like I'm trying to make something terrible into something acceptable. But I've had 12 years to think about this, and I've reached a point where I can either accept it or go mad. I've chosen to accept it. I've accepted that my job as a ranger is not to protect people from the wilderness. The wilderness was here first. It will be here after we're gone. My job is to help people understand and respect it. And sometimes that means warning them about things we don't fully understand. The rule about Kettle Creek Trail, the unspoken warning about not going there after dark, that's what I can offer. That's the protection I can provide. It's not perfect. It doesn't prevent all disappearances, but it probably prevents some. And maybe that's enough. Frank Whitmore and I have discussed what happens when I eventually retire or transfer. Who will maintain the record? Who will pass on the rule? Who will understand that the silence is not indifference, but a form of respect? I don't have answers to those questions. The system of silence is not formalized. It doesn't have succession plans or written protocols. It just persists, ranger to ranger, deputy to deputy, carried forward by people who understand that some truths are too large and too incomprehensible to be spoken aloud. But I trust that it will continue. Because once you've experienced what I've experienced, once you've stood in that space where the normal rules stop applying, you can't just pretend it didn't happen. You have to acknowledge it somehow. Even if the acknowledgement is made through absence, through omission, through a casual suggestion that someone should really be back by sunset, the rule will persist. I also want to say something to anyone who might be listening to this and thinking about testing the theory. Anyone who might be thinking about hiking Kettle Creek Trail, specifically to see if what I'm describing is real. Anyone who might think that they're somehow different, somehow protected by skepticism or knowledge or their own confidence, please don't. I'm not saying this as a ranger speaking officially. I'm saying this as a person who has experienced something I cannot explain, something that I would not wish on anyone else. The lights you might see are real. The footsteps you might hear are real. The trail that stops being a physical thing and becomes something else that's real too. And if you go far enough, if you stay long enough, if you make the decision to keep going deeper into that space, you will not come back. Not in any meaningful sense. You will become part of something larger than yourself, and you will become a question that your family never gets to answer. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to the people who love you. Respect the rule. Respect the silence. Respect the fact that some places on this earth are not meant to be fully understood or explored. I've been thinking about what I'll do when I eventually leave the Forest Service. I'm not planning to leave soon, but I know I can't do this job forever. Someday, someone else will take my place. Someone else will maintain this district. Someone else will pass on the unspoken rule. And I wonder sometimes if I should leave a letter, a documented explanation of the rule, to be passed on to whoever comes after me. A written record, separate from my journal accounts, that explains clearly what the rule is and why it exists. But I've decided against it. Because once something is written down, it becomes official. It becomes something that can be challenged, questioned, investigated. It becomes a liability. The rule is stronger precisely because it's not documented, because it's passed down orally, informally, ranger to ranger, carrying the weight of 40 years of accumulated experience, but no official source. That's how it survives. That's how it persists. That's how it remains plausible to deny while remaining impossible to ignore. I think I'll leave one thing, though, for whoever comes after me. I'm going to place a copy of James Whitmore's original journals in the Ranger Station archives. Not in the active files where they're easily found, but somewhere they can be discovered by someone who's looking. Someone who's already figured out that there's a mystery to solve. And I'm going to include one item with them. The original map that Whitmore drew, showing the locations of the disappearances. The point of no return at mile 4.5. And one note in my own handwriting. The trail is still there. The rule is still there. So is everything else. Pass it on. That will be my legacy. Not an answer, but a question. Not a solution, but an acknowledgement. I think that's appropriate. I want to end by saying something that I haven't said directly yet. I'm afraid. I'm afraid every time I go into the forest now. I'm afraid of the silence. I'm afraid of the footsteps. I'm afraid of what I might find on the trail that shouldn't be there. I'm afraid of what I haven't found yet. I'm afraid of the pattern continuing. I'm afraid that someday I might go past mile 4.5 and not find my way back. But I stay. I maintain the trails. I pass on the rule. I document what I can document. Because that's what you do when you understand something that you can't explain but know to be real. You live with it. You respect it. You warn others about it, even when you can't fully articulate the warning. And you accept that there are limits to what human beings can control or understand. The forest is older than we are. It will be here after we're gone. And within that forest, there are places that operate according to rules that we didn't write and can't rewrite. Kettle Creek Trail is one of those places. And if you ever find yourself there, on a clear evening, with a full moon lighting the trail, and you hear a ranger casually mention that you should really be back by sunset, listen. Don't ask why. Don't investigate. Don't assume that you're the exception to a rule that no one can fully articulate. Just listen and turn back, because the footsteps are patient. The lights are always there, waiting in the darkness between the trees. And the trail, past mile 4.5, is still taking people at regular intervals, year after year, just as it has for as long as anyone can remember. My name is David Harrow. I've been a park ranger in Idaho for 12 years now. And I know that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some warnings are meant to be unspoken. Some trails are meant to be walked only in daylight, by people who understand that they are guests in a place that belongs to something else entirely. The trail is still open. It will remain open, and I will remain here, maintaining the silence, passing on the rule, documenting what I can in private, and hoping that the next ranger understands what all of this means. The taking will continue. It will continue after I'm gone. It will continue as long as the forest exists, and as long as people choose to walk beneath its canopy. Some things in nature are beyond our understanding. Some things simply are, and the best we can do is acknowledge them from a distance, respect them, and warn others to do the same. Don't go to Kettle Creek Trail after dark. The rule is there for a reason, and the footsteps are always waiting to remind you why. When I was preparing this account for recording, I received another call. It was from Deputy Nash. He said that a new piece of equipment had been found on Kettle Creek Trail. It had been discovered by a maintenance crew doing work on the upper section of the trail. It was a cell phone, still powered on, still receiving signal despite being in the forest for several weeks. The phone belonged to Jason Wheeler. The maintenance crew found it at mile 6.4, which is farther than any of the previous discoveries. Nash said that when they examined the phone, they found the call log. Jason had made one outgoing call on the day he disappeared. The call had lasted 17 minutes. The number he called was Rachel's. Rachel said she never received the call. She said Jason never called her that day. But according to the phone's records, he had tried. I don't know what that means. I don't know if Jason had reached out across that boundary between worlds and tried to contact the person he loved. I don't know if Rachel didn't answer because the call never reached her, or because she was ignoring it, or because something about the nature of that place made the call untraceable. But I know that Jason Wheeler is still there, still trying, somehow, to reach back. The rule persists. The taking continues. And somewhere in the forest, on a trail that shouldn't exist but does, something is still waiting, still collecting, still maintaining its domain. This is my final warning. This is my confession. This is my record of what I know to be true, even though I can't prove it. The wilderness is not entirely ours. Some places belong to something else. And some trails should never be walked alone, especially not after the sun is set. I'm David Harrow, and I know what waits in the darkness. Every ranger station in Idaho has a laminated sheet of rules taped inside the supply closet door. Rules visitors never see. Rules written for staff only. Most of them are boring. How to log a firewood permit. How to file a bear encounter. Who to call if the backup generator fails at the guard station during a lightning storm. But at the station where I worked, there was a rule nobody could explain. Nobody remembered who typed it. Nobody had ever taken it down. Not in the 11 years I worked there. Not in the 20 years before that, according to the ranger who trained me. It was Rule 9, sandwiched between a note about propane tank inspections and a reminder to log elk sightings for the wildlife biologist. Rule 9 said this: if you hear your name called from the trees, do not answer. If you hear it a second time, leave the trail immediately. If you hear it a third time, you are already being followed before you heard it the first time. I want to tell you that I laughed the first time I read it. I did laugh, actually. I was 24 years old, new to the district, still breaking in a pair of boots that hadn't yet learned the shape of my feet. And I remember turning to the ranger who trained me and asking if this was some kind of hazing joke they played on rookies. He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me for a second too long, the way a man looks at you when he's deciding whether you're ready to hear something. And then he said, "Just follow it," and went back to organizing trail permits like the conversation was over. It took me almost 4 years to understand why he answered me that way. It took me longer than that to understand what Rule 9 was actually protecting people from. And honestly, I'm still not sure I understand all of it. Even now, even after everything that happened on Coldwater Trail, even after the search, even after the report that came back missing its last 2 pages. I'm telling you this because I don't work for the Forest Service anymore, and because I think somebody should say it plainly, the way it happened, without smoothing off the edges to make it sound more reasonable than it was. My name doesn't matter for this. I'll tell you I go by Roy, because that's close enough, and because some of the people in this story are still alive, and I'd rather not make their lives harder than the last few years already have. What matters is that I spent 11 years as a ranger in the backcountry of central Idaho, in a district I'll call the Bitter Basin District, inside a wilderness complex big enough that you could walk for 4 days in a straight line and never cross a paved road. I want you to understand that before anything else, because everything that happened only makes sense once you understand how big that country is and how alone you can be inside it. I didn't come into this job scared of the woods. I grew up hunting with my father in the Panhandle, spent summers as a teenager working trail crews for pocket money, and by the time the Forest Service hired me on full time, I had probably logged more nights sleeping outdoors than most people log nights sleeping in their own bed. I wasn't the kind of ranger who jumped at a snapping branch. I'd handled black bears wandering too close to a campground, hikers with broken ankles 4 miles from the trailhead, lightning strikes that started spot fires in under a minute, a man who had a heart attack at 6,000 feet and somehow survived because his hunting partner knew CPR. None of that scared me the way people might expect. Fear in this job usually has a name, a cause, a slope that's too steep, weather moving in faster than the radio predicted, an animal defending a den. You learn to respect those things instead of fearing them, because respect keeps you alive and fear makes you careless. I'm telling you this so that when I describe what happened later, you understand it wasn't coming from someone who spooks easily or someone who wanted a good story to tell at the bar. I've had 11 years to explain what happened to myself in ordinary terms. I've tried. I still check the gate at the top of the old Kestrel Road every October, even though I don't work there anymore, even though nobody asked me to, because some habits don't let go of you just because you left the job. The Bitter Basin Ranger District sits along the edge of one of the largest roadless areas left in the lower 48, a stretch of central Idaho backcountry so remote that when the Forest Service needs to resupply a fire lookout, sometimes the only practical way in is by helicopter or a 3-day pack trip on foot. Our station, Widow Pine, was the last staffed post before the wilderness boundary. Past our gate, the maintained road turned into a Forest Service track, and past that track, the trail system took over, threading through drainages with names most people outside the district have never heard: Coldwater Trail, Marrow Creek, Sable Ridge, Panther Fork, and above all of it, unused since the 1980s, a decommissioned logging route we still called the Old Kestrel Road, even though it hadn't carried a vehicle in longer than I'd been alive. The station itself was a single-story log building, built in the 1950s, with a covered porch, a radio room that doubled as an office, 2 bunk rooms in the back for seasonal crew, and a supply closet where somebody sometime had taped up that list of rules. We had running water from a spring line, a propane generator for backup power, and a radio repeater on the ridge above us that gave us line-of-sight communication with dispatch in town, most of the time. I say most of the time because there was a dead zone about 2 miles up Coldwater Trail, right where the trail crossed a rock slide below Elkhorn Saddle, where the terrain swallowed the signal completely. Every ranger who worked that trail knew about the dead zone. It wasn't unusual. Radio dead zones are common in mountain country, caused by nothing more mysterious than granite and elevation. I bring that dead zone up now, because it matters later. Hold on to it. The rhythm of a season at Widow Pine followed the same basic shape every year, and I think it's worth describing that rhythm before I get further into what made certain parts of it strange, because the strangeness only stands out against a backdrop of routine, and the routine at a station like ours was about as ordinary as backcountry work gets. We opened the station in early May, once the access road cleared of snow enough for a truck to make it up from the highway, and we closed it down again in October, once the first hard freeze made the pipes and generator more trouble than they were worth to keep running. In between those two dates, the district saw a slow build of visitor traffic, starting with a trickle of early season hikers willing to deal with lingering snowpack on the higher trails, building through July and August into the busiest stretch of the year, and tapering off again through September as the days shortened and the first hunting seasons opened. We had a campground about a half-mile below the station, 16 sites along a bend in the creek, staffed most seasons by a campground host named Arlene Detmer, a retired school teacher who'd been running that campground on a volunteer basis for almost as long as Hollis had been working the district. Arlene lived in a small camper, parked at the edge of the campground loop from May through September, and she knew more about the day-to-day texture of that place than almost anyone, because she was there every single day, watching who came and went, listening to campfire conversations drift across the loop in the evenings, noticing the kinds of small details that never make it into an official report because there's no form built to capture them. Above the station, on a rocky point about 2,000 feet higher in elevation, sat a fire lookout tower that had been staffed seasonally since the 1930s, though by the time I worked the district, it operated only during the highest fire danger months of the summer, typically late July through early September. The lookout that summer, and for several summers running, was a quiet, capable man named Sam Whitfield, who'd worked lookouts across 3 different national forests over a long career and had a reputation among the small community of people who do that particular job for being unusually attentive to detail, the kind of observer who noticed things other lookouts might have written off as heat shimmer or bad light. I mention Arlene and Sam here because both of them, independently over the years I worked that district, told me things about that mountain that never made it into any official file, the kind of accumulated local knowledge that exists in every remote place but rarely gets written down, because nobody in a position to write an official report wants to be the one who puts something unverifiable into a permanent record. I'll tell you what they told me later, in the order it actually reached me, because I think the order matters almost as much as the content. Our permit system, like most backcountry districts, required anyone planning an overnight trip past the trailhead to fill out a self-issue permit at a station kiosk, noting their planned route, group size, and expected return date. Day hikers weren't required to permit in the same way, though we encouraged sign-ins at the trailhead register for exactly the kind of situation that eventually happened with Emily Pruitt, so that if someone went overdue, searchers would have some starting information to work from. The system wasn't perfect. People forgot to sign out when they returned safely, which meant our overdue lists always ran a little inflated with false alarms, hikers who'd come and gone without anyone updating the log. But it gave us a baseline, a rough sense of who was in the backcountry on any given day, and it was that baseline, more than anything else, that let us respond as quickly as we did once Emily's car was found, still sitting at the trailhead, well past her expected return. The radio system tied the station to a network of repeaters positioned on high points throughout the district, relaying our handheld transmissions back to a dispatch center in town that also handled county sheriff and county fire traffic. Most of the district enjoyed reasonably solid coverage, better than a lot of backcountry areas I'd worked in previous seasons elsewhere. The dead zone below Elkhorn Saddle was, On paper, nothing more than an unfortunate quirk of terrain, a fold in the mountain that blocked line of sight to the nearest repeater, regardless of which direction you angled a handheld radio. Every ranger who worked that trail learned to expect roughly a half-mile of silence in that stretch, and to plan check-ins accordingly, timing them to happen just before or just after that section rather than during it. It was such an ordinary piece of trail knowledge that nobody thought twice about it, the way you don't think twice about a stretch of highway that always loses cell signal on your regular commute. I'd also spent enough seasons in that drainage to have a working sense of its wildlife patterns, the kind of baseline knowledge that develops without conscious effort when you spend enough hours moving quietly through the same stretch of forest season after season. Elk moved through the lower meadows in early morning and evening, bedding higher in the timber during the heat of the day. Black bears worked the berry patches along the creek bottoms through late summer, generally avoiding the trail itself, except in years when berry production was poor and hunger pushed them into less cautious behavior. Mountain lions were present, as they are throughout most of that country, rarely seen but occasionally heard, and their presence was the explanation Mateo and most of the seasonal crew reached for, reasonably, whenever the birds went quiet, in a way that didn't have an obvious cause. I want to be fair to that explanation, because for most of my first 2 seasons, I believed it too, or at least I believed it enough to stop actively questioning it. Mountain lions do silence a drainage. They do move without sound. It's a real phenomenon, well documented, and it's the kind of explanation a reasonable, experienced outdoorsman reaches for before reaching for anything stranger. What eventually made me stop trusting that explanation wasn't any single dramatic event. It was the accumulation of small details that didn't fit a mountain lion's actual behavior, gathered slowly across dozens of ordinary patrol days, the way sediment builds a sandbar 1 grain at a time until one day you notice you can walk across water that used to be a channel. My normal duties were about as unglamorous as you'd expect. I checked backcountry permits, maintained trail signage, monitored campfire restrictions during dry seasons, assisted search and rescue when hikers got lost or injured, and did wildlife monitoring for a biologist who came through twice a year. I knew every switchback on Coldwater Trail well enough to walk it in the dark, which I sometimes did, because summer patrols started before sunrise to beat the afternoon heat. I knew which meadows held elk in September, which creek crossings flooded after a hard rain, which overlooks the day hikers like to photograph, and which sections of trail visitors almost never bothered to walk because they were steep and unrewarding compared to the views lower down. One of those unrewarding sections was the stretch of Coldwater Trail that climbed toward Elkhorn Saddle, and eventually connected, if you kept going far enough, to the head of the old Kestrel Road. Almost nobody hiked that far. The maintained trail essentially ended at a small overlook about 3 miles in, and the Forest Service had quietly stopped maintaining the trail beyond that point sometime in the early 2000s. There was a small sign at the overlook, the kind you'd walk past without reading twice, that said the trail beyond this point receives no maintenance. Hike at your own risk. Most visitors turned around there. Most, but not all. I want to walk you through the first time something on that trail didn't sit right with me, because at the time I didn't think much of it. I know how that sounds now, knowing what I know, but you have to understand that in a job like this, you spend so much time explaining strange things away with ordinary causes that you build a kind of reflex for it. A reflex that, looking back, I think was tested on purpose, slowly, over years, by something that understood exactly how rangers think. It was a Tuesday morning in late June, my 3rd season at Widow Pine. I was doing a routine patrol up Coldwater, checking trail conditions after a wet spring, logging downed trees for the maintenance crew, and generally making sure the trail was safe before the July crowds arrived. The morning was clear, cool enough that my breath still showed a little below the tree line. The kind of morning where the forest sounds like it's just waking up. Birds, squirrels working through the duff, a woodpecker somewhere up the drainage, working a dead snag in that stuttering rhythm you get used to without noticing. About 2 miles in, close to where the trail starts climbing toward the dead zone below Elkhorn Saddle, the birds stopped. Not gradually, not the way birdsong fades when a hawk passes overhead and every songbird in earshot goes quiet out of instinct. This was different. It was like someone had reached out and turned a dial to 0. 1 second the drainage was full of the ordinary noise of a forest morning, and the next, nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no wind moving the tops of the lodgepole pines, even though I could see the crowns swaying slightly above me, which meant there was wind, just no sound of it reaching the ground. I stopped walking. I remember standing there for maybe 30 seconds, doing what any experienced outdoorsman does when the woods go quiet like that, which is check the sky for a raptor, check the ground for fresh predator sign, and generally assume something bigger than me had just moved through and put every prey animal on alert. I didn't see a hawk. I didn't see fresh tracks. I didn't see anything at all, which, if I'm honest, was somehow worse than seeing something, because it meant I couldn't explain the silence with a cause I could point to. I want to be clear that at the time, I didn't think it meant anything. Mountain silence happens. Pressure changes before weather moves in can do strange things to how sound carries. A predator passing just out of sight can silence a drainage without ever showing itself. I logged the silence in my head as a mildly interesting detail, the kind of thing you might mention to another ranger over coffee, and kept walking. About 400 yards further up the trail, the silence broke, but not back into birdsong. It broke into a single sound, sharp and close, that I initially took for a branch cracking under the weight of snowmelt runoff, or maybe a squirrel dropping a pine cone from high in a lodgepole. A single dry snap off to my left, maybe 30 feet into the timber. I stopped again. I looked. There was nothing there that I could see, just the ordinary tangle of deadfall and young fir that you find in any second-growth stand recovering from an old burn. I stood still for a solid minute, watching, the way you do when you think something might be moving and waiting for a repeat of the sound to help you locate it. Nothing repeated. The birds came back on their own after another minute or two. First, a single chickadee somewhere close, then the rest of the drainage slowly filling back in with normal noise, the way a room fills back up with conversation after somebody says something awkward and everyone decides to move past it. I finished the patrol that day without anything else unusual happening. I noted 3 downed trees for the trail crew, checked in with 2 backpacking parties heading up towards Sable Ridge, and hiked back down to the station by early afternoon. I did not write the silence up in my patrol log. There was no box on the form for it. What would I have even written? Birds stopped. Then a stick broke. Then birds started again. It wasn't the kind of thing you report. It was the kind of thing you forget, or you would have forgotten, if it had only happened once. It didn't only happen once. Over the following 2 seasons, I noticed the same pattern on that same stretch of trail often enough that I started, privately, keeping track of it in my own head, the way you start noticing a pattern in something you can't quite name yet. The silence always happened in roughly the same spot, that stretch between mile 2 and mile 2.5, right around where the trail starts its climb toward the dead zone below Elkhorn Saddle. It didn't happen every time I hiked through there. Maybe 1 trip in 5, 1 trip in 6. But when it happened, it always happened the same way. Total silence, sudden as a switch being thrown, followed a few minutes later by a single sound, usually a snapped branch. Sometimes something softer that I could only describe as a footstep in duff. And then, after a pause, the ordinary noise of the forest returning like nothing had happened. I asked the senior ranger about it once, a man named Hollis Cobb, who had worked the district for almost 30 years before I arrived. A quiet, weathered man who didn't talk more than he needed to, and had a reputation for having seen just about everything the backcountry could throw at a person. I asked him, casually, over coffee at the station, whether he'd ever noticed the birds going dead quiet on that stretch of cold water below the saddle. Hollis didn't answer right away. He set his coffee down, which I remember because it was such a small, deliberate gesture, and looked at me the same way he'd looked at me the day I asked about Rule 9. "You hike up past the overlook?" he asked. I told him I did sometimes when the trail crew needed conditions checked that far. "Don't go up there alone anymore," he said. "Not past the overlook." I asked him why, half expecting some story about a grizzly sighting or a rock slide hazard, something with an ordinary explanation I could file away and respect appropriately. He didn't give me one. He just said that in almost 30 years he'd stopped hiking that section alone sometime in the late 90s, and he'd never told anyone the full reason why, and he wasn't planning to start with a ranger who'd been on the job 3 years. He said it without any drama in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd made a big production out of it. Then he picked his coffee back up and asked me about the trail crew's progress on a bridge repair further down the drainage, and the conversation was over. I want to pause here and tell you something about how authority works in a job like this, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. When you work in a wilderness district, especially a remote one, you develop a deep respect for the people who've worked it longer than you. Hollis Cobb had pulled bodies out of avalanche debris. He'd talked down an armed poacher without ever drawing his own sidearm. He'd spent 3 winters as the sole staff member keeping the station running through weather that would have broken most people. When a man like that tells you, flatly and without explanation, to stop hiking somewhere alone, you don't need the explanation to take it seriously. You take it seriously because of who's telling you. So I stopped hiking that stretch alone. When trail conditions needed checking that far up, I brought a second person, usually a seasonal crew member named Mateo, who worked trail maintenance most summers and didn't mind the extra mileage. Mateo noticed the silence too, the first time it happened while we were hiking together, though he chalked it up to a mountain lion working the drainage, which was a reasonable explanation and one I let stand between us for a long time because it was easier than the alternative, which was that I didn't have an explanation at all. I think this is the point in the story where I should tell you about David Larson, because his case is the reason Rule 9 exists, as far as I've ever been able to piece together, even though nobody at the station would confirm that directly, not even Hollis, not even years later when I finally got him talking about it properly. David Larson was a 38-year-old hunter from a town about 2 hours from the district. An experienced backcountry hunter by every account I've read. The kind of man who'd been coming to that same drainage every fall for over a decade to hunt elk. In late September, more than a decade before I started at Widow Pine, Larson hiked up Coldwater Trail alone, planning a 4-day solo hunt with a camp set up near the overlook, intending to push further up toward Elkhorn Saddle during the days when he had good weather. He checked in at the station before heading out, which was standard practice for backcountry hunters in that district, logged his itinerary with the ranger on duty, and told the front desk he expected to be back out by the 4th day, maybe the 5th, if the elk were cooperating. He never came back out. When Larson missed his checkout date by 2 days, his wife called the station, worried, and the district initiated a search. I want to walk you through the search timeline in some detail, because the details matter, and because I think most people who hear a story like this skip past the procedural parts too quickly, when actually, the procedural parts are where the strangeness usually shows itself first. buried inside otherwise ordinary decisions made by tired, competent people trying to do their jobs correctly. The first search team went up Coldwater Trail on the morning of the 6th day. A 4-person crew, including 2 rangers, a search and rescue volunteer, and a tracking dog named Copper, handled by a volunteer named Ruth Alvarez, who worked with the county's search and rescue unit and had brought her dog on dozens of searches across that district over the years. Ruth's dog was well-trained, experienced, calm under pressure, the kind of dog you'd trust with a real search rather than a training exercise. The team found Larson's camp intact near the overlook, tent still standing, sleeping bag still laid out inside, a stove and cook kit still set up nearby, exactly the way an experienced hunter would leave them, expecting to return that same evening. His truck was still parked at the trailhead. His rifle, however, was not in the camp. Neither was his pack or his boots, which suggested he had left the camp intentionally, on foot, presumably tracking an animal or scouting terrain further up the drainage. This is where the search gets strange, and where the official record and the version I eventually pieced together from Hollis start to diverge slightly, in ways that I think matter. Ruth's dog, Copper, picked up a scent trail leading away from the camp toward the trail's continuation up toward Elkhorn Saddle, which made sense, following the logical path a hunter would take. The dog worked that trail confidently for almost a mile, according to the search log, right up until the point where the trail crosses the rock slide below the saddle, the same stretch where the radio dead zone sits, the same stretch where I would later notice the birds going silent. At that point, according to Ruth's own statement, which I eventually read in the case file years later, Copper stopped tracking. Not lost the scent the way a dog loses a scent when wind or rain disrupts it, which happens on nearly every search and is treated as a routine setback. Ruth described it differently. She said the dog planted all 4 feet, refused to move forward another step, and would not be coaxed, bribed, or commanded past that point on the trail, no matter what she tried. She said Copper had never refused a command like that in 6 years of working together, not once, not even during a search that had required the dog to walk within a few feet of an aggressive black bear the previous summer. She said the dog didn't act afraid exactly. She said it acted like it had simply decided on its own authority that the search was over, and there was nothing she could do to convince it otherwise. The search team pushed forward without the dog, continuing on foot up toward the saddle, following the general direction the scent trail had indicated before Copper stopped. They found Larson's boots about 300 yards further up the trail, sitting upright side by side just off the trail's edge, laces still tied the way a man ties boots when he's taking them off deliberately, not the way boots come off in an accident or a struggle. There were no socks nearby. There was no explanation offered in the report for why an experienced hunter 4 miles into remote backcountry would remove his boots and continue on in socks or bare feet in late September, with overnight temperatures already dropping into the 30s. They did not find David Larson that day. They did not find him the following day either, despite an expanded search that brought in additional volunteers and a helicopter for an aerial pass over the drainage. The helicopter search is its own strange footnote in the record. The pilot reported seeing what he described in his statement as a shape moving through the trees near the saddle, upright, moving at what he called a walking pace across terrain steep enough that walking should have been difficult, visible for only a few seconds before it moved back under tree cover and could not be relocated despite 2 additional passes. The pilot's statement noted that the shape did not match the gait or coloring of an elk or a bear, the 2 most common large animals in that drainage, but the official search summary attributed the sighting to a startled elk, likely misjudged in size, and movement due to altitude and lighting conditions. The pilot, according to Hollis, never fully accepted that explanation, though he also never pushed back on it publicly, and he stopped flying search missions for that district within a year. The search continued for 11 days before it was formally scaled back to a periodic patrol status, which is the polite bureaucratic term for what happens when a search stops actively deploying resources but technically remains open. David Larson's file remains open to this day. His rifle was never recovered. His boots were logged into evidence and eventually returned to his wife, along with his tent and camp gear, none of which showed any sign of animal disturbance, weather damage, or struggle. His wife, according to Hollis, asked one question at the final briefing that nobody at the district could answer, and that nobody has been able to answer since. She asked why, if her husband had removed his boots deliberately and walked away from them on his own. Search dogs across 3 separate attempts over the following 2 years were never able to pick up his scent again anywhere in that drainage, not once, as though his trail had simply stopped existing at the exact point where his boots were found. Arlene Detmer told me her part of this story during my 2nd season. On an evening when I'd stopped by the campground to check in with her about a bear that had been getting into unsecured coolers along the loop. We got to talking, the way you do on a slow evening with nothing urgent pressing, and somehow the conversation turned to the old trail beyond the overlook, and Arlene, who rarely offered up information unprompted, told me something she said she'd never bothered mentioning to any of the younger rangers because she didn't think they'd take it seriously, coming from a retired school teacher who spent her summers hosting a campground rather than actually working the trails. She said that in her 2nd year hosting the campground, long before David Larson ever hiked up that trail, she used to hear, on certain still evenings, a sound drifting down from somewhere up the drainage that she could only describe as someone whistling. Not random notes, she said, but a specific short phrase, 3 notes repeated, rising, then falling, then holding on the last note longer than the first 2. The kind of tune a person might whistle absent-mindedly while working, or the kind of call 2 hunters might use to signal each other's position across a distance. She said she asked around the campground at the time, assuming it was a hiker or hunter camped somewhere up the trail, but nobody ever claimed it, and none of the guests she asked reported hearing it themselves. Even guests camped in sites much closer to the trailhead than her own site was. She heard it, by her own count, perhaps a dozen times over the years she hosted that campground, always in the evening, always drifting down from the same general direction, always that same 3-note phrase. She told me she'd mentioned it once, early on, to a ranger who worked the district before Hollis's time, a man long since retired and, as far as she knew, passed away. And that ranger had told her, in almost the exact tone Hollis later used with me, not to worry about it, and to let him know immediately if she ever heard it during daylight hours instead of evening, which she said struck her as an odd thing to specify unless he already knew something about when it was more likely to happen. She never did hear it during daylight, not in all her years hosting that campground, but she told me something else that evening that I've never fully been able to shake. She said that the summer Emily Pruitt disappeared, during the days of the active search, she heard that same 3-note whistle 3 separate evenings in a row, closer to the campground than she'd ever heard it before, close enough on the 3rd night that she said it felt, in her words, like it was coming from just past the tree line at the edge of her own campsite, rather than from somewhere up the distant drainage. She said she didn't sleep well that week, and that she never mentioned it to the search coordinators because she didn't think a whistled tune would seem relevant next to a missing graduate student, and because, if she's honest, she said, She was a little afraid of what it would mean if someone took her seriously and asked her to explain more. I asked her, that evening at the campground, whether she thought the whistling and whatever had happened to Larson and later to Emily were connected. She was quiet for a while, coiling up a length of garden hose she used to fill the campground's water tank, and then she said something that I think about often. She said she didn't know if they were connected the way two facts in a police report are connected, cause and effect, clean and provable. But she said that in 30 summers of living on that mountain, more continuously than almost anyone else in the district, she'd come to believe that the drainage above the campground had its own long memory, and that whatever lived up there, whatever it was, seemed to get a little bolder, a little closer to the edges of where people actually stayed. Every time it lost someone it had been following, as though it were reminding itself, or reminding them, or reminding whoever might be listening, that it hadn't gone anywhere. I didn't know what to do with that the first time I heard it. I still don't, entirely. But I've never forgotten the specific detail of the 3-note whistle. And years later, on the night we searched for Emily Pruitt and heard that voice calling from the wrong direction on the slope below the saddle, I remember thinking, in the half-second before Deputy Iverson moved toward the sound, that some small part of the drainage's usual evening quiet felt like it was holding its breath, the exact same way Arlene had described. I didn't know any of this when I started at Widow Pine. Hollis told me the bones of it, reluctantly, over the course of several conversations spread across almost 2 years. Usually late in the evening, after a long patrol, usually after I pushed him on some detail he'd rather not have discussed. I think he told me because he saw, in the way I described the silence on Coldwater Trail, something he recognized, and I think it worried him more than he let on. That's why the rule's up in the closet, he told me once. The closest he ever came to directly confirming the connection. Somebody wrote it after Larson. I don't know who. I wasn't here yet either, not when it happened. But I've heard my name called from up there twice in 30 years, and both times I turned around and didn't ask questions. I asked him what happened when he heard it. He said the first time, early in his career, he answered before he understood the rule, called back into the trees the way anyone would when they think a person is calling for help. Nothing happened immediately, but he said for the rest of that season he had the distinct, persistent sense of being watched on that trail, even in sections far from where he'd heard the voice, a feeling that didn't fade until winter closed the district down and gave the forest a few months to, in his words, forget about him. The second time, years later, he didn't answer. He turned around, hiked out, and didn't go back up that section alone again. He said he couldn't prove that not answering had mattered. Couldn't prove any of it, really. Couldn't offer me anything more scientific than 3 decades of instinct telling him some things in that drainage were better left unacknowledged. I want to be honest with you. For a long time, I treated all of this the way I think most reasonable people would treat it, as folklore. As the kind of story that develops around any remote place with a genuine, unsolved disappearance in its history. The kind of story that grows a little stranger every time it's retold, gathering details the way a snowball gathers mass rolling downhill. I respected Hollis too much to argue with him, and I respected the trail enough to keep bringing a second person up past the overlook, but privately, I filed the whole thing under legend. Something to think about on a quiet night at the station, not something I genuinely believed was going to change how I did my job. That changed the summer Emily Pruitt went missing. Emily Pruitt was 24 years old, a graduate student from out of state, spending her summer working a seasonal position at a research station about 40 miles from our district, using her days off to explore the backcountry trails in the area. She was an experienced day hiker, not a backpacker exactly, but someone comfortable covering serious mileage on foot, someone who'd hiked sections of the Pacific Crest Trail the previous summer, according to her permit application. Someone who by every measure available to us should have been more than capable of handling a day hike up Coldwater Trail and back. She checked in at the station on a Thursday morning in early August, logging a day hike itinerary to the overlook and back, telling the ranger on duty, who happened to be Mateo that day, that she planned to be back at her vehicle by early afternoon. Mateo remembered her clearly when I talked to him about it later, because she'd asked good questions about the trail conditions, the kind of questions an experienced hiker asks, and because she'd mentioned, almost as an aside, that she was hoping to get some photographs of the overlook in good morning light before the haze from a distant wildfire thickened the air later in the day, which was a real concern that summer, given the fire activity to the west. She did not return to the trailhead by early afternoon. She did not return by evening. Her vehicle, a gray hatchback with out-of-state plates, was still sitting in the trailhead lot when Mateo did his evening patrol sweep and noticed it, along with a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper that he initially mistook for a parking notice and almost didn't bother to read. It wasn't a parking notice. It was, as best any of us could determine, a piece of paper torn from a small notebook, the kind hikers sometimes carry for trail notes, with a single line written on it in handwriting that did not match any sample of Emily Pruitt's handwriting that investigators were later able to compare it against. The line said, simply, "Still on the trail, don't wait." I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because it's the detail that changed how the entire district responded to this case. And it's the detail I've turned over in my mind more times than I could count in the years since. If Emily Pruitt had written that note herself, planning to hike longer than expected, it would have been reasonable, even considerate, a courtesy left for anyone who might notice her car and worry. But the handwriting didn't match. Investigators compared it against notes in her research station paperwork, against a trail journal later found in her dorm room at the research station, against a grocery list on her phone. None of it matched. The letters were formed differently, heavier, with a slant that leaned the opposite direction from her natural handwriting. Whoever wrote that note, it was not Emily Pruitt, and yet somebody had folded it precisely enough to wedge under a windshield wiper on her specific vehicle in a trailhead parking lot that saw, on an average August day, maybe a dozen other vehicles come and go. Mateo called it in immediately. I was on duty at the station when the call came through, and I remember the particular quality of urgency in his voice over the radio, a controlled urgency, the kind trained people use when they're trying not to alarm anyone unnecessarily, while also making clear that something needs to happen right now. We initiated a search protocol that evening, even though full dark was still an hour or two off, because an overdue hiker with a strange note left on her vehicle was not a situation anyone wanted to wait on until morning. The first search team that went up that evening consisted of myself, Mateo, and a county sheriff's deputy named Iverson, who had responded to the trailhead once the note was reported. We covered the maintained section of trail as quickly as we safely could in fading light, calling Emily's name at intervals, checking off-trail areas where a hiker might have wandered while chasing a photograph or a view. We reached the overlook, the 3-mile point where the maintained trail effectively ends, just as the light was going fully blue, and found nothing there. No sign of her, no dropped gear, no footprints in the soft ground near the overlook that we could confidently attribute to her, though the ground there gets enough foot traffic that isolating one set of prints would have been difficult even in daylight. It was at the overlook, in that fading blue light, that Deputy Iverson asked a question that none of us had a good answer for. He asked whether it was normal for a day hiker on a 3-mile trail to leave a note suggesting she planned to continue further, given that the maintained trail simply stopped at the point where we were standing. Mateo and I looked at each other, and I think we both understood, without saying it out loud in front of the deputy, exactly what that question meant. If Emily Pruitt was still on the trail, as the note claimed, she had continued past the overlook, onto the unmaintained section, up toward Elkhorn Saddle. Up past the point where Hollis had told me, years earlier, never to go alone. We made the decision, the three of us, to continue a limited search past the overlook that evening, rather than wait for full daylight and additional resources, given the note's implication that Emily might still be actively moving on the trail, and given the narrow window of remaining light. In hindsight, I understand why we made that call. Every hour matters in a search, especially with temperatures at elevation dropping fast after dark. And a hiker unprepared for overnight conditions can develop hypothermia faster than most people realize, even in August. But I also think now that we made that decision without fully weighing what we already knew about that section of trail. Because knowing it and truly believing it are two different things, and none of us, I think, had crossed fully from one to the other yet. About a half-mile past the overlook, right around where the trail begins its climb toward the dead zone, the birds went silent. I felt it before I consciously registered it. The way you sometimes notice a room's temperature drop before you notice you're cold. Mateo noticed it too. I could tell from the way his pace slowed slightly, his head turning to scan the tree line on either side of the trail the way mine was doing. Deputy Iverson, who didn't know the trail's reputation the way we did, didn't seem to register anything unusual, and kept calling Emily's name into the darkening timber at regular intervals, his voice carrying that particular flatness of someone doing a job they've done many times before, a job that's mostly about covering ground and following protocol rather than expecting an actual answer. We got an answer. It came from somewhere up the slope to our right, off the trail, muffled by distance and timber, but unmistakably a voice. And unmistakably, at least to my ear in that moment, a young woman's voice, calling out something that might have been help, or might have been someone's name, distorted just enough by distance that none of us could be fully certain which. Deputy Iverson moved immediately toward the sound, calling back, telling her to stay where she was, that we were coming. I want to be honest that in that moment, I didn't think about Rule 9 at all. I didn't think about David Larson or Hollis Cobb's 30 years of caution. I thought about a 24-year-old woman alone in the dark, possibly injured, possibly hypothermic, and I moved toward that sound the same way Iverson did. Because that is what you do. That is what the job requires of you. And no amount of half-remembered folklore overrides that instinct when someone might genuinely need help. Mateo hung back for a moment, and I noticed it even as I was moving, because it was so unlike him. He called out to me, low, urgent, "Roy." That came from the wrong direction. I didn't fully process what he meant in the moment, focused as I was on picking a safe line through the deadfall toward the sound. It was only later, going over it with him afterward, that I understood what he meant. The voice had seemed to come from upslope, off the trail's right side, but the terrain in that direction climbed steeply into a section of old burned snag forest that would have been nearly impossible for an uninjured hiker to traverse quickly, let alone an injured or exhausted one, and there was no logical route by which Emily Pruitt, if she had continued up the maintained trail as her note suggested, could have ended up in that specific position. Mateo's read, forming in real time even as we moved toward the voice, was that whatever we were hearing was not coming from where a lost hiker plausibly could be. We searched that slope for nearly 40 minutes, as full dark settled in, using headlamps, calling continuously, receiving 2 more responses during that time, both of them positioned differently than the first, both of them just distinct enough in direction that by the 3rd call, all 3 of us had independently begun to suspect something we weren't yet willing to say out loud to each other. A person moving on foot through burned snag terrain in full darkness does not relocate that quickly or that quietly. We heard no footsteps between the calls, no branches breaking underfoot, despite the terrain being thick with exactly the kind of deadfall that makes silent movement nearly impossible for a human being. Deputy Iverson was the one who finally said it, and I remember exactly how he phrased it, because it was so carefully neutral. The way trained people speak when they're trying to describe something without committing to an interpretation they're not ready to stand behind. He said, "That's not tracking like a person moving." Nobody argued with him. We called off the slope search around 10 o'clock that night, made the decision as a group to retreat to the overlook, and from there back down to the trailhead, both because continuing to search that terrain safely in full darkness was becoming genuinely hazardous, and because, though none of us said this part directly to each other that night, something about continuing to move toward that voice had started to feel less like a search and more like being led somewhere. We radioed dispatch requesting a full search team assembly for first light, standard protocol for an overdue hiker who had now been missing overnight, and hiked back down in a tight group, headlamps on, not talking much. Each of us, I think, turning the last hour over privately in our heads. That was the night I understood, fully and without room for the comfortable distance of folklore, that whatever Hollis Cobb had spent 30 years quietly avoiding on that trail was not a story. It was something that had learned, at minimum, how to imitate a distressed human voice well enough to move 3 trained searchers half a mile off a marked trail in the dark. What it was beyond that, I still cannot tell you. I want to be honest about that limitation rather than filling it in with something that sounds more satisfying than the truth, because the truth is that after everything I'm about to describe, I still don't have a name for what we were dealing with on that mountain, only a catalog of things it did and things it seemed capable of, gathered slowly, at cost, over the better part of a decade. The full search assembled the next morning at first light, a much larger operation than the previous evening's improvised effort. It included 6 Forest Service personnel, 4 county search and rescue volunteers, 2 additional tracking dog teams, and by mid-morning, a helicopter dispatched from the regional office to run aerial passes over the upper drainage and the terrain around Elkhorn Saddle. Emily Pruitt's parents had been notified overnight and were already en route from out of state. A detail I mention because it grounds this in the way these cases actually unfold, not as an isolated wilderness mystery, but as an unfolding crisis for a specific family who spent the following days in a motel 40 minutes from the trailhead, waiting for news that, as of the writing of this, has still never fully come. The search grid that first full day covered the maintained trail thoroughly, the overlook and its surrounding off-trail terrain, and pushed as far up the unmaintained section toward Elkhorn Saddle as conditions safely allowed. One of the tracking dog teams, an experienced handler named Denise Okafor with a dog named Ranger, worked the trail from the overlook forward and picked up what she described as an intermittent scent trail, a trail that would hold for 100 yards or so and then simply stop, as though the person being tracked had, at multiple points along the route, ceased to leave a scent at all, only to have the dog pick the trail back up further along the path. Denise had worked search dogs for over a decade and told investigators afterward that she had never experienced a scent trail behave that way before. Not from weather disruption, not from water crossings, not from any environmental cause she could identify. The trail simply stopped and started in a pattern that eventually led the dog to the same stretch below Elkhorn Saddle where Copper had refused to continue years earlier during the Larson search. Ranger did not refuse outright the way Copper had. Denise's account, which I read later in the case file, described the dog instead as growing increasingly agitated the closer they got to the rockslide crossing, whining, circling, and eventually sitting down directly in the trail and refusing forward movement, though not with the same flat, immediate refusal Copper had shown. Denise described it as though the dog wanted to continue and was afraid to, a distinction she found more unsettling, in her own words, than an animal simply refusing outright, because it suggested something closer to genuine fear rather than pure aversion. The helicopter search that afternoon produced the discovery that ultimately defined this case in the official record, and also the discovery that raised more questions than it answered. Around 2 in the afternoon, the helicopter crew spotted a backpack hanging in the upper branches of a lodgepole pine on the slope below Elkhorn Saddle, roughly 20 feet off the ground, visible from the air, but essentially invisible from the ground due to the density of the surrounding timber. Ground teams were directed to the coordinates and, after nearly an hour of difficult bushwhacking through deadfall and thick young growth, located the tree and confirmed the pack matched the description Emily's parents had given, a blue and gray day pack she'd been seen wearing that morning at the station. Getting the pack down required a technical rope team, since the branch it was caught on was high enough and thin enough that climbing to it directly wasn't safe. It took most of the remaining daylight that day to retrieve it. When they finally got it to the ground and opened it, the contents were, by every account I've read, and every account Hollis relayed to me from people who were present, exactly as Emily Pruitt's roommate at the research station described her having packed that morning. Water bottle, 3/4 full, a trail map, folded to the section covering Coldwater Trail, a granola bar, unopened, a light rain shell, folded the specific way her roommate said she always folded it, a habit apparently distinctive enough that the roommate could describe it in detail without having seen the actual pack. And the zipper was fully closed, every compartment sealed, despite the pack having spent, at minimum, more than 24 hours exposed to weather 20 feet up in a tree, including several hours of light rain that had moved through the drainage overnight. The contents were dry. I want to be precise about what that means, because I think it's easy to hear a detail like that and let it slide past without fully registering how strange it is. A backpack left exposed overnight in rain, even a light rain, even with the rainfly closed, will typically show some moisture intrusion, some dampness along seams or zippers, especially a pack of that quality. A mid-range day pack, not some expedition-grade waterproof bag. This pack showed none. The search team's incident report noted the dryness as an observation without offering an explanation, which is standard practice for reports, noting what was found without speculating on causes that can't be verified. But everyone who was there that day, according to Hollis, understood that the dryness didn't have an easy answer. The same way David Larson's untouched boots hadn't had an easy answer more than a decade earlier. The search continued for the following 9 days, expanding its grid, bringing in additional dog teams, running repeated helicopter passes, and eventually incorporating a specialized team trained in technical rope rescue to search steep terrain around the saddle that ground crews couldn't safely access on foot. During those 9 days, 3 more incidents occurred that I think are worth describing in detail, because each one added another layer to what we were dealing with, and because each one, in its own way, still haunts the people who experienced it. The first happened on the 3rd day of the expanded search, during a radio check-in between 2 search pairs working different sections of the grid. Mateo was paired that day with a volunteer named James, doing a sweep of the timber below the rockslide crossing, while I was working with another crew member higher up near the saddle itself, coordinating with dispatch back at the station. Radio communication in that section was, as I've mentioned, unreliable due to the dead zone, cutting in and out depending on exact position and atmospheric conditions. During one of Mateo's scheduled check-ins, dispatch, back at the station, received a transmission that was not from Mateo's radio. The transmission, according to the dispatcher on duty that day, a longtime station employee named Carol, who had worked radio traffic for the district for almost 15 years, came through clearly, on the correct frequency, but was not Mateo's voice, not James's voice, and did not match any registered call sign working the search that day. It was, Carol reported, a young woman's voice, calm, almost conversational, asking a single question. "Are you still on the mountain?" Carol responded immediately, standard protocol, asking the caller to identify themselves and state their location. There was no response. She tried twice more over the following minute, then flagged the transmission as an unauthorized or interfering signal, possibly bleed from another agency's frequency or a malfunctioning radio somewhere in the search area, and logged it as an anomaly in the day's communications record, which is standard practice when something can't be immediately explained. When Mateo and James came back into radio range 20 minutes later for their scheduled check-in, Carol asked them directly whether either of them had transmitted that message. Both denied it. Mateo told me later that when Carol described the voice to him, described its calm, almost pleasant tone, asking whether he was still on the mountain, he felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the elevation. The second incident happened on the 5th day, and it's the one I have the hardest time talking about, because it happened to me directly, and because I've spent years trying to find an explanation for it that doesn't require believing something I'm not sure I want to believe. I was working a section of trail alone that afternoon, technically against Hollis's old advice about never going up there alone, but the search had stretched our staffing thin enough that solo coverage of certain lower priority grid sections had become unavoidable if we wanted to maintain search pace. I was moving through a stand of timber below the main trail, checking a drainage that fed into Coldwater Creek, calling Emily's name at regular intervals, the way search protocol requires, when I heard, clearly, from somewhere close behind me, maybe 20 feet back along the route I'd just walked, my own name. Not Emily's name, mine. I want to describe exactly what that sounded like, because the specificity matters. It was not a distorted or garbled version of my name, the kind of thing you might mistake for wind moving through branches or a bird call that happens to land on a similar syllable. It was clear, and it was spoken in a voice that, God help me, sounded almost exactly like my own voice, the way your voice sounds on a recording, slightly off from how you hear yourself, but unmistakably recognizable as your own. I turned around. There was nothing there, just timber and the trail I'd just walked, empty in both directions as far as I could see through the trees. I did not answer it. I want to be honest that some part of that decision was Rule 9 sitting in the back of my mind after years of half believing it, and some part of it was simple instinct, the same instinct that keeps you from putting your hand into a dark space you can't see into, a caution that doesn't require full understanding to activate. I stood still for what felt like a long time, though it was probably less than a minute. And then I did exactly what Hollis had told me he'd done the second time it happened to him. I turned around and I hiked out of that drainage, back to the main trail, back down toward the station, moving faster than the terrain strictly required, though I told myself, at the time, it was simply good pacing. I did not hear my name called a second time that day. I want to note that specifically because Rule 9's escalating structure, the difference between hearing it once, twice, and 3 times had always struck me as oddly specific for a piece of station folklore, the kind of detail that sounds invented for dramatic effect rather than genuinely observed. After that day, I stopped thinking it sounded invented. I reported the incident to Hollis that evening, quietly, away from the rest of the search team, because I didn't know how to write it up officially without sounding like I'd lost my composure under stress, which is a serious concern in this line of work, where your reliability during a search is directly tied to your credibility for future assignments. Hollis listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he didn't offer me any comfort or explanation. He just asked whether I'd answered. I told him no. He nodded once and said, "Good," and that was the entire conversation. I understood, without him needing to say more, that he had decided a long time ago not to explain this thing to anyone, not because he didn't care, but because he genuinely didn't have an explanation. And pretending otherwise would have been a kind of lie he wasn't willing to tell. The third incident, and the one that I think most directly connects this case back to David Larson's disappearance more than a decade earlier, happened on the 7th day of the search, when a ground team working the rock slide crossing below Elkhorn Saddle found a set of footprints in a patch of soft mud near the creek that ran alongside the trail at that point. There were two distinct sets of prints in that mud, overlapping in a way that suggested they had been made at different times but along the same narrow path of passable ground. One set was clearly a hiking boot print, a specific tread pattern that, when photographed and compared later, matched the boots Emily Pruitt had been wearing, based on a photo her roommate had taken of her gear the morning before she disappeared. The other set, pressed partially over and partially beside the boot prints, was bare. Not a boot print with the tread worn smooth, which is a distinction search teams are trained to recognize, but a genuine bare foot impression, toes and arch and heel all present in the mud, with the kind of detail that only comes from direct skin contact with soft ground. The search team photographed the prints extensively before the site was disturbed further, and those photographs eventually made their way into the official case file, where they remain to this day. Filed but never publicly released, according to Hollis, because the department couldn't produce an explanation for them that wouldn't invite more questions than it answered. What made the bare footprints strange? Beyond simply being bare in terrain that would be brutal to cross without footwear, was their proportions. They were roughly the size of an adult human foot, within a normal range, but the toe spacing was subtly wrong, spread slightly wider than a typical human print, and the impression depth suggested a weight distribution that didn't match how a human foot typically strikes the ground while walking. One of the search team members present, a wildlife officer named Grant, who had spent years reading animal tracks professionally as part of his job, examined the prints and told the group, according to Hollis's account, that he could not identify them as belonging to any known animal species in that ecosystem, and that if he had to guess, based purely on the print's general shape, he would have said human, except for the parts that clearly weren't. Grant's official statement, filed as part of the case record, was more measured than that. It described the prints as an unidentified bipedal track pattern of uncertain origin, and recommended further analysis that, as far as I've ever been able to determine, was never actually completed, either because the resources weren't available or because someone higher up the chain decided further analysis would raise questions the department wasn't prepared to answer publicly. I don't say that as an accusation against any specific person. I say it because I understand, now, in a way I didn't understand as a young ranger, how institutions handle things they can't explain. They don't cover them up, exactly. Not in the deliberate, conspiratorial sense people sometimes imagine. They simply stop pursuing them past the point where pursuing them would require admitting, formally, in writing, that something exists which the institution has no framework for handling. The file stays open. The report stays filed. Nobody lies about what was found. They just quietly stop asking the next question. The search for Emily Pruitt continued for 11 days total, before being scaled back to periodic patrol status, the same designation David Larson's case had received more than a decade earlier. The same designation that meant, in practical terms, that active resources would no longer be deployed unless new evidence emerged, while the case technically remained open indefinitely. Her parents held a small gathering at the trailhead on the final day of the active search, a quiet, devastating scene that I was present for because I was assigned to provide logistical support. Standing at the edge of a group of maybe 20 people, while Emily's mother read a short statement thanking the search teams for their effort, her voice breaking on almost every sentence, her husband standing beside her with one hand on her shoulder and an expression I have never fully been able to describe, except to say that it was the look of a man trying to hold two impossible facts in his mind at once: that his daughter was gone, and that nobody could tell him what had actually happened to her. Before I get to that, I need to tell you what Sam Whitfield reported from the lookout tower during those 11 days. Because his account never made it into the official search record either. Not because anyone suppressed it exactly, but because a lookout's radio reports of distant lights and movement are treated, understandably, as low-priority information compared to ground-level search data, the kind of thing that gets acknowledged and logged without ever triggering a dedicated follow-up. Sam had a clear sightline from his tower down into the upper reaches of the cold water drainage, including a partial view of the slopes around Elkhorn Saddle, though thick timber blocked full visibility into the deepest parts of the drainage where most of the search activity was concentrated. On the fourth night of the search, well after full dark, Sam radioed the station to report a light moving along the ridge below the saddle, in terrain he knew for certain no search team was actively working that night, since all ground crews had been called back to base camp before dusk as standard safety protocol. The light, according to his report, was steady rather than flickering, more consistent with a handheld flashlight or headlamp than with anything like a campfire or lightning-related phenomenon, and it moved along a rough contour line at a walking pace for close to 10 minutes before disappearing behind a shoulder of the ridge. Sam knew that terrain well enough, from years of watching it through binoculars during long, uneventful lookout shifts, to know that the route the light appeared to be following did not correspond to any trail, marked or unmarked, official or informal. It cut directly across a slope steep enough that Sam himself, an experienced backcountry traveler, told me he wouldn't have chosen to cross it at night, even with a bright headlamp and careful footing, let alone at the steady, unhurried pace the light seemed to maintain. He reported it to dispatch immediately, and a note was made in the search log, but with all ground teams already back at camp for the night and the terrain considered too hazardous for a night deployment, based on a single light sighting, no team was sent to investigate until the following morning, by which point, predictably, there was nothing to find. Sam reported the same light, or one behaved identically, on 2 more nights during that 11-day search, always following a similar contour, always disappearing behind the same shoulder of ridge, always during the hours after ground teams had been recalled for the night. What struck Sam most, he told me later, wasn't the light itself. Isolated lights in remote country can sometimes be explained by other search personnel, poachers, or even atmospheric phenomena under certain conditions, and he was cautious about overstating what he'd seen. What struck him was the radio interference that accompanied each sighting. Each time he raised dispatch to report the light, his own radio transmission came through fine, clear enough that Carol back at the station had no trouble understanding him. But each time, in the minute or two immediately following his report, his radio picked up a low, steady static that he described as different from ordinary interference, not the harsh crackle of a weak signal or a storm front moving through, but something closer to a hum, almost rhythmic, that faded out on its own after a minute or so without him touching any of his equipment. He mentioned it to Carol each time it happened, and each time she confirmed she hadn't heard anything unusual on her end, which meant, as far as either of them could determine, that whatever was generating that static was local to Sam's tower, or local to the airspace immediately around it, rather than something affecting the wider repeater network. Sam wasn't a superstitious man, by his own description, and he told me directly, the one time I asked him about it face to face, that he didn't like being lumped in with what he called mountain talk, stories that grow with every retelling, until they stop resembling whatever actually happened. But he also told me, in the same conversation, that he'd worked lookouts in 3 different states over almost 20 years, and that in all that time, he had never experienced radio interference that behaved the way it did during those 3 nights, appearing only in the minutes after he reported the light, fading out completely once he stopped transmitting, never once repeating on any other night that entire season, before or after the search. He retired from lookout work 2 years after the Pruitt search, citing ordinary reasons: his knees, the isolation, a grandchild he wanted to spend more time near. I believe those reasons were genuine. I also believe, because he told me so himself, on his last evening at the station before driving out for the final time, that he had made a private decision somewhere during that search never to accept another lookout assignment in a district with a drainage like that one in it, wherever it might be, and that he'd never told his supervisors the real reason behind that particular preference, because he didn't think it would survive being written down in a personnel file, and because, in his own words, some things are better carried quietly than explained badly. I want to tell you now about what happened after the search was scaled back, because this is the part of the story that I think most directly connects back to Rule 9, and to the strange handwritten note found on Emily's windshield, and to a piece of the official record that, as far as I know, has never been shared outside a very small circle of people who were directly involved. About 3 weeks after the search wound down, Hollis asked me to accompany him on what he described, vaguely, as a personal errand up Coldwater Trail. Not an official patrol, not logged in any duty roster, just the two of us hiking up past the overlook on a quiet weekday afternoon when no other search or maintenance activity was scheduled in that section. I asked him what we were doing. He said he wanted to check something, and that he'd rather show me than explain it, which was about as much as I'd learned to expect from Hollis when it came to this particular subject. We hiked up in mostly comfortable silence, the kind two people who've worked together long enough can share without needing to fill it with talk. The birds went quiet in the usual spot, right around mile 2.5, and neither of us commented on it, both of us simply continuing to walk at the same steady pace, the way you keep walking through rain once you've already accepted you're going to get wet. About a quarter mile past where Emily's backpack had been recovered from the tree, Hollis stopped at a section of trail where a rock slide had partially buried the old route decades earlier, forcing hikers to pick their way across loose talus for about 30 yards before the trail resumed on the far side. He pointed to a spot just off the trail's edge, at the base of a large boulder, where a strip of red flagging tape, the kind trail crews used to mark survey points or hazards, was tied around a low branch of a stunted subalpine fir. I asked him if that was crew flagging, thinking maybe a survey team had marked something there recently that I hadn't been briefed on. He told me no. He said Forest Service crews hadn't worked that section in years, not since the trail maintenance budget had been cut back, and that stretch beyond the overlook had been quietly deprioritized. He said he'd first noticed a strip of red flagging tied in almost that exact spot nearly 20 years earlier, not long after David Larson disappeared, and that he'd removed it at the time, assuming it was leftover survey marking from an old project. He said it had reappeared, tied in the same spot or close to it, at least 4 more times over the following 2 decades. Always red, always the same general knot style, always appearing during periods when he knew for certain no authorized crew had been working that section. He said he'd stopped removing it years ago. He said he wasn't sure anymore whether removing it did anything or whether it even mattered, but that he'd started instead simply noting when it appeared and photographing it before it inevitably vanished again a few weeks later, gone without any sign of having been cut or untied, as though it had simply ceased to be there. I asked him what he thought it meant. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at that strip of faded red tape, moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel at ground level, and then he said something I've never been able to fully shake. He said he didn't think the tape was a warning, not in the way a hazard marker warns you away from something. He said he'd come to believe, after 20 years of watching it reappear, that it functioned more like a mark on a map, the kind you'd use to note where something had already happened, or where you expected something to happen again. He said he didn't know who or what was tying it, and he'd genuinely stopped trying to find out, because Every path of inquiry he'd tried, over 2 decades, had led nowhere except back to more red tape and more silence in the birds. I photographed the flagging that day, on my own phone, a habit I picked up from Hollis without ever fully deciding to. I still have those photographs. I've compared them over the years to photographs I've taken of flagging that appeared in that same general area on at least 3 separate occasions since. Once about 2 years after the Pruitt search ended, once roughly 4 years after that, and once more, the most recent instance, less than 18 months before I finally left the job. Each time, the knot style is consistent. Each time, it appears without any record of an authorized crew working that section. Each time, it vanishes within a matter of weeks, without any evidence of removal. I don't know what it means. I want to be honest about that, the same way Hollis was honest with me. I have theories, the way anyone would after enough years turning a question like this over in their head late at night, but I don't have proof of any of them. And I think claiming otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty, the kind that turns a genuine unsolved mystery into a tidy story with a satisfying ending, which this was never going to be. There's one more piece I need to tell you about, because it's the piece that finally made me request a transfer out of the Bitter Basin district, and it's the piece that I think more than anything else made me understand that whatever we were dealing with on that mountain was not confined to a single stretch of trail, and was not, in some sense I still can't fully articulate, finished with us. It happened almost 2 years after Emily Pruitt's disappearance, during a routine equipment check at the station in early spring, before the summer season had fully started, and before the trail had reopened to regular patrol traffic after winter closure. I was going through the old case files in the station's records room, a task nobody particularly enjoys, but that falls to whoever has downtime during the slow shoulder season, when I came across the original incident report filed for the Pruitt search, the master document that consolidated all the individual team reports into a single official record. I want to describe the report as I found it, because what I found, and what should have been there according to the report's own internal page numbering, did not match. The report was numbered sequentially, page 1 through page 43, according to a table of contents at the front, listing each section, witness statement, and piece of evidence cataloged during the search. When I actually counted the physical pages in the file, there were 41. 2 pages were missing, and based on the table of contents, the 2 missing pages corresponded to a section labeled Additional Witness Observations, filed after the search had officially concluded, dated roughly 6 weeks after the final search day, well after Hollis and I had gone up to look at the red flagging tape together. I asked Hollis about it, showing him the discrepancy directly, the missing page numbers, the table of contents that clearly indicated something had once been there. He looked at the file for a long time without saying anything, and then he told me, quietly, that he remembered those pages, because he was the one who had originally filed them. He said they contained a statement he'd given roughly 6 weeks after the search ended, describing an encounter he'd had alone on the trail, near the same rock slide crossing that he'd initially hesitated to report at all, and had only ended up documenting because a supervisor at the time had specifically asked him to file a complete account of his and my early reports about hearing our own names called, wanting a formal record, for reasons Hollis was never fully told. He wouldn't tell me the full content of what those pages said, and I want to respect that he never did. Even years later, even after I pushed him on it more than once, what he did tell me was that whatever he described in that statement had been serious enough that within a month of filing it, the district supervisor at the time, a man who left the agency not long after, and whom I never met, had called Hollis into his office and told him directly that the additional witness observations section was being removed from the official file, that the case would remain open under its existing findings without that section attached, and that Hollis was not to discuss its contents further with search team members or with the public. Hollis said he never learned exactly why the decision was made, whether it came from higher up the agency chain or was the supervisor's own call, and that by the time he thought to ask more questions about it, the supervisor had already transferred to a different region and was, for all practical purposes, unreachable. I sat with that information for a long time after Hollis told me, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath, and eventually I stopped trying to find out more. I think that's the part of this story that's hardest for people to accept when I tell it. Harder even than the voices or the footprints or the strange dryness of a backpack that had spent a night in the rain. People want a resolution. They want to know what was in those missing pages, what Hollis actually saw, what happened to David Larson and Emily Pruitt, what the thing on that mountain actually is. I don't have any of that for you. I have 11 years of small, accumulated, unresolved details, each one insufficient on its own to prove anything, all of them together sufficient to convince me, completely, that something is up there that I will never be able to explain using the tools this job gave me. I left the Bitter Basin District about a year after finding those missing pages, requesting a transfer to a different region, a decision I framed to my supervisors at the time as wanting new scenery, new challenges, which wasn't entirely a lie, but also wasn't the whole truth. I still keep in touch with Mateo, who eventually left the Forest Service entirely and now works in a completely unrelated field, somewhere far from any wilderness boundary. A choice I've never asked him to explain because I think I already understand it. Hollis retired about 2 years after I transferred out, and as far as I know, he still lives not far from the old district. Close enough that I know for a fact he still drives up to the trailhead every autumn alone and hikes up to check the gate at the head of the old Kestrel Road, a piece of infrastructure that hasn't served any practical purpose in longer than either of us has been alive, but that he told me once he checks anyway, because it feels like the kind of thing somebody should still be doing, even now, even after everything. I haven't told you yet about the last time I hiked that trail alone, and I think I need to, even though it's the part of this story I've put off the longest in the telling, because it's the part that finally convinced me to request my transfer, more than the missing pages, more than the red flagging tape, more even than hearing my own name called from the trees that afternoon during the Pruitt search. It was late September, almost 3 years after Emily disappeared, in the last week before the station closed down for the season. I'd told myself I was going up to do a final gate check on the old Kestrel Road before winter, the kind of routine end-of-season task that fell to whoever had the time. And I told myself further that going alone was fine because the season's traffic had thinned out enough that there was no real search and rescue risk in a short solo trip. And because I'd hiked that trail more times than I could count by that point, and knew every switchback of it, as well as I knew the inside of the station, I want to be honest that some part of me also wanted to go alone. 3 years of hearing Hollis's caution, 3 years of watching Mateo grow quieter every season, 3 years of carrying a mystery I couldn't share with anyone outside a small circle of people who already believed it, had built up in me a kind of restless need to test it myself, on my own terms, without an audience, the way you sometimes need to touch a stove you've been warned about just to know, for yourself, exactly how it feels. The hike up was unremarkable for the first 2 miles, cool and clear. The aspens along the lower trail already turning gold in patches. The kind of early autumn day that makes you remember why you took a job like this in the first place. The birds went silent right on schedule in the usual spot, and I kept walking. the way I always had, the way the job had trained me to. Past the overlook, on the unmaintained stretch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before in all my previous trips up that section. A fresh set of boot prints in a patch of damp ground beside the trail, overlapping an older set of bear prints in a pattern I recognized immediately from the photographs taken during the Pruitt search. The same subtly wrong toe spacing, the same unnatural weight distribution. The boot prints were fresh enough that I could see individual grains of displaced dirt still settling at their edges, which meant, if my read of the ground was right, that they'd been made within the last hour or two on a stretch of trail where I had seen no other hiker sign-in at the trailhead register that morning, and no other vehicle parked at the lot when I'd started my own hike. I stood there for a long time, looking at those prints, longer than was strictly wise given the light I had left, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of. An unregistered hiker who'd skipped the sign-in sheet. A hunter scouting early ahead of the season opener. A trail runner moving fast enough that I might have simply missed them at the trailhead. None of those explanations accounted for the bare prints underneath, layered in a way that suggested, at minimum, that whatever had made them had passed through that exact spot recently enough that the ground hadn't had time to soften the edges of the impression, and recently enough that it had happened, as best I could judge, sometime that same morning, while I was already on the trail myself, somewhere below. I did not continue up toward the saddle that day. I turned around at that spot, did not check the gate at the head of the old Kestrel Road, which I'd told myself was the entire point of the trip, and hiked back down faster than I've ever covered that stretch of trail before or since, checking over my shoulder more times than I'd like to admit, listening for a voice I was fairly certain, by that point, I did not want to hear again. I filed my transfer request less than a month later. Mateo left the Forest Service entirely about a year after I did, and when I finally asked him directly, years later, over a phone call, why he'd walked away from a career he genuinely loved, he told me it wasn't any single incident that did it. He said it was the slow accumulation of small choices the job kept asking him to make, choices between following a reasonable protocol and following an instinct he couldn't justify on paper, and that, eventually, he got tired of a job that required him to keep choosing between those two things every single season, with no guarantee he'd choose correctly the next time. He works, now, somewhere that has nothing to do with wilderness, nothing to do with search and rescue, nothing to do with radios or trail permits or backcountry silence. And he told me, the last time we spoke, that he sleeps better than he has in years, though he also told me he still, without meaning to, notices when a room goes suddenly quiet, and that some part of him doubts that particular habit will ever fully go away. Emily Pruitt's case remains open. Her parents, as far as I know, still live in the same town they lived in the summer she disappeared, and I understand, secondhand through people who've stayed more connected to the district than I have, that they still call the ranger station every August, around the anniversary of the day she went missing, to ask whether anything new has come up. Nothing ever has. David Larson's case, older, colder, receives far fewer calls now, though I've heard his widow, into her 70s at this point, still sends a card to the district office every September, a quiet, private ritual that nobody at the station has ever had the heart to discourage. Coldwater Trail is technically still open to the public, at least up to the overlook at Mile 3. The Forest Service never formally closed it, in part, I suspect, because closing it would require an official justification that nobody has ever been willing to put in writing. The unmaintained section beyond the overlook remains, as it always has, marked with nothing more than a small sign warning that the trail beyond that point receives no maintenance and should be hiked at your own risk. A sign that tells the truth in the most literal sense, while saying almost nothing about what that risk actually involves. I still think about Rule 9 sometimes, taped inside a supply closet in a station I no longer work at, worn soft at the corners from years of hands brushing past it to reach for other supplies, probably read by dozens of new rangers over the years the same way I first read it, with a half smile and a private assumption that it was some kind of inside joke. I hope, whenever a new ranger reads it now, that somebody older, somebody who knows better, tells them to take it seriously, the way Hollis told me, without needing to explain why. I hope they listen the way I eventually learned to listen, before it costs them what it nearly cost the people whose names I've told you here, and the ones whose names I haven't, because I suspect, though I can't prove it, that David Larson and Emily Pruitt were not the first, and I don't believe, whatever I hope otherwise, that they were the last. 2 years ago, long after I'd transferred out of the district, I got a call from Mateo, who'd heard through an old contact still working at Widow Pine that a strip of red flagging tape had turned up again in the usual spot, below Elkhorn Saddle, photographed by a seasonal crew member who had no idea about its history and had simply logged it as an unusual trail marker in his daily report before it disappeared again 3 weeks later, the same way it always has. Mateo told me about it over the phone, and neither of us said much else for a long moment after he finished. Just sat there on opposite ends of a phone call, two men who used to work that mountain together, listening to each other breathe. I don't hike that trail anymore. I don't think I could, even if the job ever called me back there, even if someone asked me directly. But I know Hollis still drives up every October to check that gate on the old Kestrel Road, and I know that somewhere on that mountain, in a drainage most people will never walk into, the birds still go silent at the same stretch of trail they always have, right before something that has never fully shown itself calls out, patiently, in a voice that sounds almost exactly like someone you'd trust, waiting to see whether, this time, anyone answers. Just last year, long after I'd left the district for good, I heard through Mateo's remaining contacts that a solo backpacker, a man in his 30s, attempting a multi-day loop that included a stretch of the old, unmaintained trail above Elkhorn Saddle, was reported overdue by his sister when he failed to check in as planned. The search that followed, smaller than the one mounted for Emily Pruitt, shorter in duration, produced almost nothing new beyond an echo of what had come before. His tent, found intact near the same general stretch below the saddle. His gear, dry, despite 2 days of intermittent rain. No trace of the man himself, not then, and as far as I know, not since. I don't know all the details of that search, because I wasn't there, and because the people who were there have, understandably, been less willing to talk about it than Hollis eventually was with me. But I know enough to tell you that the pattern held, one more time, in a place that has now held it for at least 3 decades, across at least 3 names that I know of, and very likely more that I don't. If you ever find yourself hiking in remote backcountry, and the woods around you go suddenly, completely silent, and somewhere behind you, close enough to feel personal, you hear your own name called clearly through the trees, I am asking you, as someone who has heard it and walked away, and as someone who has spent 11 years learning what the alternative might cost you, do not answer it, do not follow it. Turn around, walk back the way you came, and do not look back to see what, if anything, is following you out. Some trails are only closed on paper. The rest of the closure, the part that actually matters, you have to carry with you.